We won't be using any sharing of documents, screen sharing or anything like that during the session this afternoon. There is a chat function on Teams, which some of you may well use, but don't use it expecting me to look at anything because I won't. So it's not an opportunity to put any comments in to me. If you do need to contact Liz for any sort of urgent reasons during this afternoon session, you could use the chat function. It may be better to ring her on a normal number, and she's keeping an eye on that, or email her, any one of those three things, or if you're really desperate, all three of those things, you should get through to her. Anyway, we successfully went through this morning without too many technological glitches, so hopefully we can continue to do that this afternoon. What I'm going to do now, if I could please, is just to go through the list of participants that was published with the agenda at the end of last week. And I would just to check who's actually here and who's going to participate. And it's a chance for you all to just to very briefly introduce yourselves and put your microphone and camera on when you do, if you could please. So I'll start with the council. David Hand.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm David Hand. I'm the head of planning, policy, economic strategy and environment representing Darlington Borough Council.
And David Nelson.
Thank you, sir. I'm David Nelson. I'm the Principal Planning Policy Officer representing Darlington Borough Council.
Matt Usher.
Matthew Usher, Planning Officer, Darlington Borough Council.
And Fiona McCall.
Thank you, sir. Fiona McCall, Planning Policy Officer representing Darlington Borough Council.
Okay, and John Simpson.
Thank you, sir. John Simpson. I'm the Investment and Funding Manager for the Council, and I'm the author of the Viability Report.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Errington, I don't think he's here. Joanne Harding, the Home Builders Federation.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Joanne Harding. I'm the Planning Manager for the North, and I work for the Home Builders Federation.
James Seabury, Banks Group.
Thank you, sir. James Seabury, Banks Group.
Tom Baker from Savills.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name's Tom Baker. I'm from Savills and I'm representing Story Homes this afternoon.
And Martin Bonner from Savills.
Good afternoon. Martin Bonner from Savills, representing Helen's Land and Homes England in relation to Greater Faberdale.
And James Hall from Barton Wilmore.
Afternoon, James Hall representing Bellway Homes, and I'm from Barton Wilmore.
Catherine Gillison. Apologies, is that you can clarify your name? Could you put your microphone on, please, Councillor? Hello, Councillor.
Sorry, yeah, I'm just getting used to this.
No,
yes, Councillor Catherine Gilson, representing Middleton St George Parish Council.
Okay, good afternoon, Councillor. Mark Armstrong.
Thank you, sir. Mark Armstrong from Low Coniscliffe and Merrybent Parish Council.
Are you a councillor too, Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Ken Madison.
Yes, sir. My name's Ken Madison. I'm a resident of Darlington and have been for a number of years.
Okay, good afternoon. Councillor Snedker.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm back again for the next session. I'm here not only with Darlington Green Party, but also we've worked with a number of community groups, parish councils and individuals to prepare our series of representations.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bryony Holroyd.
Thank you. Yes, Bryony Holroyd, also representing Darlington Green Party and Friends Group.
Okay. Musa Chowdhury.
Good afternoon, Musa Chowdhury, Senior Planner at Barton Wilmore, and I'm representing the Church Commissioners of England.
Okay, good afternoon. Are there any other people who are wishing to participate this afternoon, who are wishing to say anything, who are in this Teams meeting? No, okay, good. Thank you for that. Right, all of the hearing sessions are public events and are being broadcast by the council on YouTube so that you can observe the proceedings, I think pretty much in live time, but they're also available to watch and I had a quick look at lunchtime at the recording from this morning, and it seemed to have worked okay. So there's a record there if anybody wishes to see a session that they didn't actually participate in, or indeed they enjoyed it so much they can watch it again and enjoy it for a second time. So no other recordings need to be made. That's there available. Any reporting of the examination through social media or any other means should be done responsibly, please. A brief reminder that the purpose of the examination is to help me to decide if the submitted plan is legally compliant and sound, and if not, how it could be modified to ensure that it is. So I'll be focusing on some of the follow-ups to the questions that I published back in April, having read all of your written statements. I'll start each agenda item with some questions to the council, just to sort of focus in on, give you all an idea of the sort of things I'm particularly keen to find out more about. And when we've heard the council's response to those, it'll be an opportunity for any other participants to comment in relation to that issue. Again, focusing particularly on the things that I'd asked questions about, but indeed, if there's anything else that was an issue that they'd raised in their written statements, I will be aware of it. But if you want to particularly draw it to my attention, you can do so. So if you do wish to speak, put your hand, raise hand icon up, and I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. And as I said, it is helpful, as well as putting your microphone, if you put your camera on when you speak. Right, emission sites I dealt with this morning, and I dealt with in the guidance note. Basically, I won't be dealing with emission sites at this session or any other because I'm examining the plan as submitted. And if I feel that there's a need for the council to allocate different or additional sites, I'd ask them to consider which ones they wish to put forward, and would then proceed on that basis. Main modifications. The council has suggested some main modifications to the plan and the changes to the policy map since it published it and submitted it for examination. And this is normal practice and is intended to ensure that the plan is sound. Schedules were published originally on the 30th of March. That was DBC2 and DBC4. That's the modifications and the policies map changes. And they obviously, you could take those into account in writing your written statements in response to the questions I had raised, and I think I referred to them in my questions as necessary. Additional schedules of main modification was published yesterday. That's DBC7, and that just sets out in one place the modifications that the council had proposed in its written statements, which are obviously subsequent to the schedules that have been published on the 30th of March. I will consider the council's proposed modifications in considering whether the plan is sound as it submitted or if it needs to be changed, and I will only recommend them if I think that they are necessary and they would make the plan sound. Action points. If I identify any further modification that needs to be written or drafted, worked up, or any other work that needs to be done during each session, I will generally make that clear, hopefully during the time, and I will probably issue an action point note after each week of hearings, which will set out any further work that I'm asking the council or anyone else to do. It's also possible there are some matters that I need longer to think about. So the fact that something isn't necessarily covered in an action point after a week of hearing sessions doesn't necessarily mean there won't be some further work that I'd ask the council to do at a later date. All of the main modifications, there's been an opportunity to comment on and discuss those put forward by the council so far, but there will also be an opportunity for formal consultation on all of the main modifications to the plan that I deem are necessary to make it sound, and that will be towards the end of the examination. So there will be another opportunity to comment formally, and those comments will be taken into account before the plan is before my report is finalised. Right, okay, I think that's it for my opening introductions, other than to say we've got this afternoon until around 5 o'clock if we need it. We may well not need that long. I'll probably have a break in about an hour, so about 3:15, something like that, have a comfort break for 15 minutes or so. Are there any procedural or technical questions that anybody has before I turn to the first item on the agenda? No, okay. Right, okay, so we'll move on to supplementary planning documents, if we could. Now, we started talking about this morning to some extent. As I mentioned then, the supplementary planning documents do have a statutory status, and there are procedures that need to be followed to publish those things. The council, as with other local planning authorities, has published some supplementary planning documents. There are also references in some policies, I think, to some master plans and other documents that are not formally part of the local plan, or indeed formally part of a supplementary planning document. So this question is really about those sort of references in the plan and whether they're given appropriate sort of weighting or reference. In response to one of my early preliminary questions towards the beginning of the examination, the council proposed some modifications to a number of policies that did refer to other documents to basically change the wording so that it wasn't quite so dogmatic as to what was expected a particular development proposal to do. So I think it was reference to being required to comply with, and those sort of references were taken out and replaced by phrases such as have regard to or to reflect. So basically a reminder that what the National Planning Policy Guidance says is that SPD, I suppose other non-statutory documents, can build upon policies in the plan. So, but not introduce significantly new or different policies. So if that is the case, given that they're meant to build upon policies in the plan, my first question, I think, to the council is, why is it justified for the plan to refer to a supplementary planning document that were prepared before it? And in the case of DC1 and the design one, several years ago. I know we touched on this morning. Any other comments in general about that from the council first, please?
Thank you, sir. If I could pick up on that one for you. Yeah, I mean, really, we acknowledge that certainly, both the SPDs that we have, the design SPD and the planning obligations SPD, both do need updating. The design SPD does still have, though, some very useful. It involved a lot of work around characterization of the town, setting various things that were almost going into, we alluded a bit this morning to design codes as well. It was, kind of going into that territory. And just in terms of offering broad parameters for development, that there's a lot of good and probably still really quite valid stuff in there. But I think what it has been identified, yes, it also links to things like Code for Sustainable Homes that's now defunct. So yeah, and I mean, really what we don't want our SPDs to do is, repeat building regulations, if you like, and things like that. That's got its own separate process, and I think really we need to leave that to do its own thing, if you like. So so what we'd like, and what we're certainly intending to do is to review both design SPD and the planning obligations SPD to just streamline them down to the things that are most relevant as DM tools, if you like, to and also to developers in terms of setting out our broad expectations of requirements. I think the other example is also the Tees Valley Highways Design Guide as well. That's another one that is quite a well-established document that, again, I think is useful as a starting point for conversation around matters around parking standards, things like that. So yeah, so I think that's another similar document. But you're quite right. Some of the wording we had originally was, shall adhere to, shall be in accordance with, and we've suggested appropriate modifications there.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Now, can I just follow up on that point before you go on to something else? So in the example of DC1, the proposed modification is changed from all development will be required to follow the design principles of the Darlington Design of New Development SPD to all development will be required to consider the design principles of the Darlington SPD. So there's still a requirement, but all you're requiring a developer to do is to consider it, which begs the question, well, what does that actually mean? And then it refers to consider the design principles. Presumably the SPD, that big SPD, has got more than design principles in it. It's got all sorts of guidance and information in it. So is it actually quite right, even as redrafted? And the other thing is there's different phrases elsewhere, and the HBF have picked up one about, I think one of the policies that referred to an SPD or another document was changed to require somebody to reflect the other document. So again, it's a slightly different phrase. I'm just wondering whether what the simple way of doing this would be, in, for example, DC1, would be to use the phrase "have regard to." So development proposals would be required to have regard to the SPD or subsequent replacement or something of that nature, rather than referring to design principles in it, for example, which sort of begs the question, why that? Maybe you could just have a think about that, and having a consistent language for reference to it. So it isn't required to consider or required to reflect or something like that. It is have regard to, because I think that would fit more squarely with national policy and guidance.
Okay. Yes.
Can I leave that one?
Be happy to
look again at some of the wording for some of those.
Absolutely.
Right. I think we're going to go on and make another point.
Yeah. I've forgotten what it was.
Sorry.
It's okay. I think it was actually a point that you did then touch upon, that the wording that we put in the policy was almost those SPDs or subsequent replacement document. And yeah, I see the point you were making in the previous session, that almost they could just as easily be completely new documents, and obviously we will have to go through the appropriate adoption procedure, consult on those documents, the full process, whether it's a new SPD or using some of the existing material in there. And to all intents and purposes, there will be new documents in SPDs. Just in relation to the planning obligations one, obviously quite a number of the obligations and the methods of calculating them have been worked into some of the policies. For example, education contributions are now worked in there, and the link to sort of nationally set and adjusted figures, if you like. And I think that's now made things like that much more straightforward, and I'm hoping that almost we don't have to provide locally justified figures on those, but I'm sure we'll talk about that in the relevant policy. But what we do have, and also we've suggested a modification to bring the method of calculation for open space calculations into the plan as well. But there will still be a role for some sort of planning obs SPD to almost clarify the working behind a number of those local considerations, like open space, that will need to take account of needs in local areas, varying costs of provision and things like that. And similar to the highway design guide, those things are a lot of detail that if we put those in a local plan, you could probably times it by 6 in terms of the length that the document would be. And also putting those type of things in a local plan would run the risk of making the local plan go out of date quite quickly. I mean, obviously we'll be reviewing the plan at least every 5 years, but other things, other regulations or particularly local needs, can change quicker than that. And we think that having a number of those things in an SPD with a hook in the local plan will be the way we can more quickly adjust to those changes and make sure the right things are delivered in the right places.
Okay, understood. I mean, there is a place for SPD because it's there in the legislation, it's there in the National Planning Policy and Guide, so that's fine in principle. And I think it's quite right for the plan to refer to it in an appropriate way, so that's okay. I think it's the balance between, as I think Councillor Holroyd said this morning, that the key principles ought to be in the plan itself, and then it's almost like the detail information, some of the detail which could change periodically because it's updated, etc., to follow through in the SPD and help to sort of implement it. So it's striking that appropriate balance. It's also a balance between the and developers are required to comply with them. Well, that's quite a rigid approach as a starting point. If the guidance, if the parking standards are in an SPD and the position is that developers should have regard to them, you know, it's a kind of starting point for negotiating. It provides more flexibility on any particular site as to what's appropriate and what's needed, and the policy itself may then set out the sort of the issue, you know, the things that would have to take into account to decide whether those standards are applied or relaxed or whatever. So I think it's that sort of balance. So I'm not wanting to unpick this plan in this sense, and I think there's just a limited number of policies. I think there's 5 or possibly 6 which refer to a SPD or another document. I think it's just asking you to go back just to double check again the wording of those and getting the right balance between what's in the plan and what isn't. So unless you've got anything else, I'll open it up to others to comment now. Okay, right. Anything else anybody else wishes to say about SPD that we haven't already said? Or do you want to particularly draw my attention to, having heard the discussion I've just had with Mr. Nelson? No? Yeah, Mr. Madison.
Sorry, yes. So I don't quite know if this is actually appropriate, but I was reading one of the SD documents, and it's the one on Tees Valley Authority local standards for sustainable drainage, and it's a 2015 document. I've got a little bit of knowledge of drainage, but not a lot. But to me, it seemed extremely out of date, and not, well, should I say, extremely generic as well. So there was very, very little specifics in Darlington about existing waterways, causeways, and the likes. Yes, I appreciate it's a standard, but things have moved on quite dramatically on that particular front. And I'm aware that Darlington, being a relatively small authority in the scheme of things, haven't got any in-house expertise on that particular front. And I do mention it in later documentations further down, but I just didn't know whether it was appropriate to mention the same sort of thing as what Mr. Nelson's been mentioning as well, and whether that forms one of those policy documents or not.
Yeah, so I think this is policy DC2, isn't it, which refers to that document that you've just alluded to.
Yeah.
So that is another one to think about. Well, I mean, it's the council's responsibility. I mean, that document does exist. I think my role is just to make sure that the wording in this plan isn't giving it too much weight or whatever. It's the council's responsibility then to decide whether it wishes to update or improve that document. I note your points. The council may well wish to comment on that, but thank you for drawing that attention anyway. Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much. Just to very briefly reiterate points made earlier today, that obviously any key points should be brought into the local plan so that they are required, and that some of the key points do need to be brought into the local plan in order to make it compliant, to meet all the climate change regulations. The flooding one, I hadn't picked up on that, but obviously you know, with climate change that is getting to be more of an issue. So the key principles and requirements do need to be brought into the local plan, and I would suggest that some of them need to be strengthened in order to make the plan compliant.
Okay, understood. Mr. Bonner.
Thank you, sir. Just a brief one from me, but it's also covered in Matter 10, but just going back to your point about having regard to the SPD and the design codes also, that's just something we would be supportive of as a change to the plan, and it's referenced in our rep. So just to confirm that, really.
Sorry, just to that's the phrase you think is appropriate. Have regard to, not any other wording. That strikes the right balance between flagging it up, but giving you flexibility to.
Exactly, yeah, flexibility is key, really. Thank you.
Okay, understood. Mr. Madison, your hand's up. Is that left over from before? Your microphone's off.
Yeah, my microphone's off. I haven't switched it off yet. It's my fault.
Okay, no worries. Right. Any other comments about SPD? Sorry, just to go back to Mr. Hand mentioned this morning about design codes. Do you need to say any more about that now, or is that something when you reflect on the wording of the ones that I've asked you to. I'm a bit reluctant to. Yeah, go on, Mr. Hand.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, because we do actually refer to design code in one of our modifications as regards greater favourable. So we will reflect on that in the wording that we should use and be consistent.
Yeah, again, it's this balance, isn't it? I mean, some of the policies refer to a master planning exercise or a master plan being prepared, which obviously delegates potentially important aspects of design and layout, etc., to something outside the plan. But if the plan policy's got enough detail in to set out the principles of what that master plan's then got to achieve, I think that's the balance. Similarly with the design code, I guess. So yeah, just reflect on that. I mean, if the design code, I mean, obviously national policy in the last couple of years has raised the importance of design codes. They're not a new thing, but it's, you know, there's a national design code and an approach. So it's perfectly valid for that to be referenced if that's the more up-to-date approach that the council's like to be taking for particular sites. Right, Fiona McCall.
Thank you, sir. It was just to come back on Mr. Madison's point on the Tees Valley document for local standards for sustainable drainage.
Yeah.
We realise, yes, it's an older document, but as far as we understand it, it's still used by local authorities to assess planning applications on SUD schemes and as such. And it's also important to know that we haven't had any objections to that particular element of the document from the Environment Agency as well, just to point that out.
It's not actually your document anyway, is it? I mean, it's a Tees Valley collective document, is it? So
yeah, I think it's something that each local flood authority uses to assess SUD schemes as part of planning applications. I think it's a set of standards within there which may seem quite generic, but is used across the Tees Valley.
Presumably allows the Mr. Madison, second please. Presumably it also allows an authority that may not have the same level of expertise that collectively there can be a resource there that provides that potentially. Is that?
Yes, that's correct. Is it? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's correct, sir.
Okay, Mr. Madison.
Yeah, so I apologise for interruption there. Yeah, I understand that some of the standards are obviously quite similar, but things have moved on. And I did point out, or did identify, that some of the standards for design was based on a 1 in 100 year storm. We've had locally within the Darlington area areas that have flooded quite badly on strategic roads over a period of 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 years. And that's the sort of thing that needs to be addressed and reviewed. Yes, the Environment Agency will be or are using different standards. And I'm sure that the Environment Agency could spend all of their time reviewing everybody's local authority plans. They've clearly got other things to do, and there is hopefully that there is expertise within, in this case, Tees Valley. But I am aware that, dare I say, there's an element of weakness within Darlington Borough Council on flooding and on flood alleviation design and management.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on Tees Valley other documents, it was mentioned in passing there, the issue about standards for parking and that sort of thing. One concern that we have is that is doesn't go out of date as we look at, especially in urban areas, less and less parking provision, and that should ensure that there is not a minimum parking provision, because other urban areas are looking at providing a maximum limit for parking, ensuring that there is parking and storage for bicycles, for example. So again, it's this danger of relying on other organisations' documents and SPDs when we need to ensure that they're brought up to standard for the design that we would like to see in Darlington.
Okay, understood. You're touching on issues we're going to come back to, because we're going to look at the policy on parking standards and cycle storage requirements and those sort of things under the transport policies. So we will come back to that. We will look at what that SPD actually says in relation to those sort of things and how the plan references it. and whether it differentiates between different types of area, because as you quite rightly say, it's not unusual to have different parking approaches to parking in town centres and urban areas to more rural areas and things, to reflect the level of car ownership and the level of use and achieving sustainable transport and those sort of things. Okay, thank you. Fiona McCall.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, just to pop back on the sustainable drainage matter. It was just to add that we do have a service level agreement with Stockton Borough Council, and they are used as a consultant, as you like, to comment and advise us on planning applications. So that's an agreement we have in place with them, and they have advised that those are the standards which are the similar standards referenced in that policy, DC2, to do with surface water runoff, and they did clarify that during the drafting of the policy that they are the rates that are used and come from the Tees Valley document, just to clarify on that point. But obviously we'll have discussions around that policy in future sessions as well.
We will indeed. So, okay, thank you. Let's move on from that, because we're focusing on the SPD and the way that's referenced. I think we've got an action point about looking at the 6 policies that currently refer to SPD or other documents and the way that's phrased. Okay, so we will move on then to the next issue on the agenda, which was about the plan period. The context for this is that the National Planning Policy Framework expects strategic policies to look ahead a minimum of 15 years from adoption. None of us know for sure when this plan will be adopted. It may be this calendar year, it may be a little after, so it may be 2022. So I suppose the question was aimed at, well, does the plan look far enough ahead? The council's response was, well, it does hope to adopt the plan in 2021, and certainly that was the intention when it prepared the plan and went ahead and set out its timetable. So it was looking far enough ahead. I don't know. I mean, whether anyone's got any comments they wish to make. Obviously, it's there is flexibility in this plan in the sense that it does look further ahead, because some of the big allocations are clearly not going to be built out in the plan period. So it is planning for quite a long way ahead from 2036 in that respect. I'm going to say now I don't have any particular concerns about this. I don't think it's something that the plan needs to be modified to do, having read, what I've had put to me and thought about it. But if anyone's got any things they wish to say on this, Mr. Hand, do you want to start, and then I'll see if anyone else has got any comments.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Obviously we planned to get the plan adopted before this, but we had a change in administration and then the pandemic, which meant that we didn't submit the plan as early as we meant to. But obviously our evidence base is based on that 20-year period. So whilst we're planning for further in the period, obviously the couple of things, we will be reviewing the plan within 5 years or earlier if the planning white paper goes through legislation. So I mean, we feel it's a relevant period that's still valid, I think.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much. I don't have any specific comments on the plan period itself. It's more whether the evidence base it's used is still up to date, given that it was prepared a good 5 years ago now. I know that updates have been produced. However, I would suggest that some of the original evidence base we will discuss no doubt in later sessions, I would find to be highly questionable, and the updates have been based on the original evidence base rather than starting from new and assessing what the situation is today, so that, if you like, any questionable issues that were built in originally are still there. Whereas we've had, obviously we know a bit more about the situation as far as jobs and population, the impact of Brexit and coronavirus, and obviously we know more now about what the future is likely to bring as far as government policies and plans. And I'm uncertain whether all that has been taken into account in any updates that have happened since the original plan was published.
Okay, well, I think probably the best way to deal with those potential concerns are when we get to particular aspects of the plan, particular policies or particular allocations, you to be specific about which bits of evidence you don't think exist or are out of date to support that particular element of the plan, because I don't think I'm going to get very far today having a kind of a general discussion about the evidence and whether it's up to date or out of date or whatever. I think it'd be better to you to bring that point in at relevant times. So, for example, if you say that, you know, a particular allocation hasn't got evidence about X, Y, or Z, or its evidence about that is clearly now out of date, so therefore you can't make any assumptions about that. That's fine. I think that'd be the best way to handle it. So, anything else about the plan period before I move on? No. Okay. Right. So the next question is the next issue is neighbourhood plans, and there's a number of things to do with this that I want to explore. So the first point to make is that, well, I'm sorry, there's one made neighbourhood plan in the borough I'm aware of that was made recently, only a year or so ago. That's the Low Coniscliffe and Merrybent neighbourhood plan. There is the Middleton to St George plan that was submitted recently and is in the examination library, and I've seen that, so we can talk about that in relation to on this agenda item, but it'll also be relevant to other things that we're going to come on to tomorrow and later in the examination, and to do with the approach in the plan and the approach in that neighbourhood plan. And there are 3 other neighbourhood areas that have been designated formally, but there aren't at the moment plans that are at an advanced stage, so they're kind of either activity started and then stopped or whatever. So that's the kind of background. The national policy position is that local plans are required to make explicit which policies in this local plan are strategic, and there's detailed national guidance, policy and guidance about that. And the plan does that, so it complies with that requirement. It identifies 25 policies, I think, out of a total of 47 as being strategic, so just over half of them. So, and that can vary quite a bit. I've seen some plans where they're nearly all described as strategic and some with a fewer. The significance of that, and I think it's the only significance of defining a policy as strategic or not, is that neighbourhood plans in the borough have to be in general conformity with the plan's strategic policies, and they should not undermine them or promote less development than the strategic policies set out. So that's the sort of background. The other thing that I want to talk about today is the national policy requirement for strategic policies in the local plan to set out a housing requirement. I think that's how it phrases it, for designated neighbourhood areas, and that housing requirement should reflect the overall strategy for the pattern and scale of development and any relevant allocations. And then there's further guidance about doing that in the planning policy guidance. So the council, policy H1 table 6.1 in the submitted plan did include housing requirement figures for each of the 5 designated neighbourhood areas. However, in response to my preliminary question, one of them, the council proposed some modifications to that to change the figures and also to include some explanatory text in relation to policy H1 to explain what those figures are and the justification for them. The figures have been further updated in another modification that was in the schedule published yesterday, DBC 7. So I suspect I'm going to ask the council to clarify why that is in a minute, but I suspect it's to do with the latest housing supply situation in terms of completions and commitments and outstanding permissions, etc. So they're the sort of elements of neighbourhood plans I want to deal with today. In terms of the spatial strategy in this plan and the extent to which it may be consistent with or conflict with other neighbourhood plans or emerging neighbourhood plans, I think we'll deal with that tomorrow. So what I want to talk about today is the 2 particular things about whether the strategic policies in this plan are appropriately defined, whether the figures for the neighbourhood areas in terms of housing figures are accurately set out in the sense of that they reflect the allocations and the commitments in the plan. Can I just go to the council then first? Do you want to start with that the detail of the housing numbers in the as they are now set out in DBC 7. They've got a table and it's got the 5 neighbourhood areas listed and specific numbers against each. Do you want to just explain clearly what those are?
Yep, of course. Thank you, sir. Yes, I'll
Yeah.
run through that. Yes, basically, the most recent update to the neighbourhood plan housing requirement figures are to reflect the updates to the housing trajectory, which have recently been completed. So this is to reflect housing monitoring over the the past financial year. The council assessors conduct sites visits and assesses housing commitments which are currently building out. So the housing trajectory has been reflected. It's been reflected in the housing trajectory accordingly, and therefore reflected in the neighbourhood plan housing requirement figures. They've also been updated to reflect more recent information on sites. So there has been some minor alterations to the phasing of a number of the allocations. So the updated figures reflect both of those aspects.
Right. Okay. So my first question is, I don't think it may be clear. I may have missed it, or it may not be clear. The figures, then, you've described them as the total of the latest information about commitments and allocations. What about completions? Do they include completions from 2016 or not?
So we've removed the completions from 2016. Yes.
Right. So they're a requirement from what date?
So it's from 1st of April 2021.
Right. I mean, it's not for me to criticise or question national policy or guidance, but if all the plan is doing is setting a requirement figure that isn't a requirement figure at all because the plan allocates and commits to it, I'm not quite sure what the purpose of these figures is, but others may be able to comment on that. I don't know.
Yes.
But this isn't a requirement in the sense it's not asking any neighbourhood plan to do anything, is it?
No, that's correct, sir. And the additional text which we've proposed through our modification schedule explains that approach, and to clarify to neighbourhood planning groups and communities that the requirements aren't for them to. It's not. They don't have to plan for those homes. They are covered via the allocations and commitments in policy H2 and the commitments table.
What would happen if one of your allocations, say one of the low Coniscliffe, I'm not saying it's going to, but what would happen? This is a theoretical question. If one of these low Coniscliffe sites just clearly wasn't going to get developed for some reason, it's in the plan, but something happened to make it not be capable of being developed. And this table is in here, setting a requirement for the low Coniscliffe and Merrybent neighbourhood area to deliver 962 homes. Would there be any implications for an alternative site in the parish?
That's a good question, sir. Obviously, that would be, you'd be looking at. There's the potential for looking for a new allocation, isn't there, if you've got it set out in your policy? I totally appreciate what you're saying. Another approach I've noticed from other authorities is to set a 0 figure for neighbourhood plan areas. So that is another option and another approach that authorities have taken, to just set a 0 figure. But I think the council just felt that it was quite straightforward in the NPPF that you were to set a requirement figure for neighbourhood plan areas. So that's why we took the approach we did. But I appreciate that scenario that you've put forward could lead to some potential issues. But
sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It's not for us to question or criticise national policy. National policy is what it is, and it does talk about having a requirement figure that reflects the allocations and the strategy in the plan. So on the face of what you've done does appear to comply with that. It does slightly worry me that the fact that it's expressed as a requirement for that area, there could come a point in the plan, but I'm not saying it will, but it's a theoretical possibility at least that it's used as I say, to sort of kind of put the argument that there's a need for another site in that area, which. It is. I mean, coming back to it, in the sense that it's that the housing strategy in your plan is based on the main urban area, and it's an extension. Those sites that happen to be in a neighbourhood area are not because they're in that neighbourhood area, are they? They're because they're an extension to Darlington. That's the rationale for it. It's not. It's that way around, isn't it?
Yes, they fall within the parish area. Yes, yeah.
So even if one of those sites if I were to consider one of those sites that couldn't be developed, or that happened in, your first alternative wouldn't necessarily be somewhere else in that parish, would it?
No, no, exactly.
Else in relation to the main area. So again,
I guess
kind of break down in logic in the sense of.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe there could be a potential under the 5-yearly review cycle, for that type of issue to be resolved if it did occur, and the policy could be updated accordingly if a site had to be found elsewhere within a different area of the borough.
Okay, I mean, I'm probably prodding a hornet's nest here, which is Mr. Baker, are you going to help, or are you going to set some hornets flying?
Well, I mean, there's a few points that we might get onto, and there's going to be a discussion on this, no doubt. But just a point you raise about the main urban area and the fact that some of these requirements overlap with sites that have just been located or allocated in the main urban area. Of course, not all of these neighbourhood plan areas are in the main urban area. So the Middleton St George neighbourhood plan requirement affects a service village. So that does have spatial distribution implications. So if a site were to disappear, that wouldn't mean that you'd look elsewhere in the main urban area. That's specifically around the spatial growth decisions around development in a service village or in Middleton St George specifically.
But actually, that's another interesting point, Mr. Baker, isn't it? Because there's no requirement nationally for the council to allocate sites to service villages. I mean, the spatial strategy in this plan is focused on the town, but it also acknowledges there's some benefits in allocating some sites to service villages and the hierarchy. So that's fine. But most of the Middleton St George figure of 860 is because of the high number of commitments there are, isn't there? Because of the process over the last few years. There's only one new allocation. I suppose the same question could arise if for some reason that allocation were not to come forward and it proved it couldn't be delivered. Would there be pressure on the council to release another site on the edge of Middleton St George because of this table? Whereas actually, would that be the preferred strategy if that site was available? So again, it's this actually helping this plan?
Yeah, well, I think there is quite a firm response to the proposition you've put forward, because well, I'll pick up 2 points there.
Yeah.
So the first thing is about whether the site that's allocated will come forward and the uncertainty around that. I mean, that is a site that Story Homes, my client, is promoting. It's a site that has a live outline planning application which was taken to planning committee and was recommended for approval with no technical constraints identified, and it's a site that ultimately wasn't taken forward for approval due to the local plan stage. And it's also a site where we've recently validated a full planning application that we intend to see through the planning system. So there's full confidence in respect to that allocation. But that, I appreciate, that's not the point that was necessarily being made at this juncture. But in respect,
so it's a theoretical issue.
It's a theoretical issue, but I was just pointing out the specifics of these circumstances. But in terms of what you're saying about Middleton St George specifically, I'll just sort of read something out from the council's distribution topic paper, and that's paragraph 7.26, and that this is in our it's actually in our matter 3 statement, because of course we do talk about distribution there. But what paragraph 7.26 of the distribution topic paper says is distribution of sites across the main urban area and service villages was not set by specific percentage requirements due to the compact nature of the borough and the reasonably straightforward settlement hierarchy. The approach was simply to allocate the most suitable and sustainable sites for development. This did result in a greater proportion of housing growth at Middleton St George, as sites put forward for allocation at Herworth and Hyington did have more constraints. The existing settlement layout of Middleton St George also meant that there were more logical options for expansion. The amount of development planned for this service village was not considered to be inappropriate, and the settlement had the existing service provision to support this level of growth. So there are specific reasons for why Middleton St George can accommodate the growth identified for service villages, to do with the low level of constraints, to do with the settlement form, to do with the services available, transportation.
Stop you there, because we're going to deal with the spatial strategy.
We are, yes. Sorry, sir. I just wanted to make that.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, it's a bit of a hornet's nest, and in the sense that that Middleton St George site almost certainly is going to get developed. Therefore, this issue won't arise there that it's going to fail, and therefore another site may come forward. So, okay. Let me bring in Councillor Gilson, please, from Middleton St George. It seems like a good chance to get a contribution from you.
Thank you. Well, there are quite a number of things that concern us here. On the way that the council have decided on the amount of housing we should receive here, there's no rhyme or reason for it. It's just a mathematical exercise. The council has not taken into account the housing needs assessment that we did in the neighbourhood plan, the character special designations within the village, and basically the needs and the considerations of the residents here. Regarding housing figures, it has just been so complicated all the way through the preparation of the local plan. It's confusing. With all of the figures, the housing figures, the completions, commitments, allocations, would be a total of 1,244, which is ridiculous to even suggest that we should bear the brunt of those. Site 61, total of 234 houses, and now that was actually, permission was approved, and most of them have been built now. That was approved pre this plan period, pre 2016. Should that be taken into consideration in the plan? I don't think so. But even if we take that out, it would still leave a total of about 950 or thereabouts. I can't remember now. The figures are all over the place. And according to the figures, there have been only 287 completions. And I don't reckon that, we don't reckon that a lot of them will get built. I know we're going to talk about Maxgate Farm at another occasion, but the situation with that, Site 99, this sort of application never came to the planning committee because it was decided, sort of identified that the council could already show a 5-year supply of housing at that stage. It was meant to come to the planning application on the 5th of June 2019. And there's all sorts of issues really regarding to we don't actually need. The main issue is that the housing needs assessment, with the neighbourhood plan, only assess the housing needs for St George for 113 to 119 houses.
Yeah, okay.
It's way out. Sorry, thank you. Yeah. No,
that's fine. So just to your plan was submitted to the council in April. What basically is the timetable? Do you know when the what's the next stage for the examination?
Well, well, we're waiting for the council to determine whether it's acceptable, and we think it is. So we just, and then from that point to appoint an examiner. So that's at the stage of that.
Okay, well, the council can update me maybe on that. Thank you very much for that. Right, Councillor Armstrong, Low Coniscliffe and Merrybent. Mr. Armstrong, could you put the microphone on? Mr. Armstrong, Councillor
Apologies.
Armstrong. No, that's fine.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to start by reading an extract from Low Coniscliffe and Merrybent Plan Written Representations under Regulation 16.
Well, I've read those.
The extract is from Fiona McCall, Planning Policy. Could I read the extract?
Well, I don't need. Is it in your statement?
No.
Okay, just give me the gist of it.
The gist of it is that what we have is conflict between Low Coniscliffe and Merrybent Parish Council Neighbourhood Plan and the emerging local plan. And essentially what we're being told is that effectively the neighbourhood plan is to be disregarded by Darlington Borough Council local plan, and it doesn't matter what development we think is right for the parish. Darlington Borough Council will make that decision. I'd like people to appreciate that the neighbourhood plan was the only tool we had as residents to shape and protect our rural parish, because Darlington Borough Council had already determined in consultation with developers as far back as 2015 that urban development would proceed within our parish. Here we are 6 years later, and Darlington Borough Council are, by virtue of the proposed local plan, simply going to ignore our neighbourhood plan. The Parish Council Low Coniscliffe, which occupies 413 acres, of which 28 hectares lies within current development limits, we actually stand to lose over 98 hectares of historical landscape and prime agricultural land within the parish to urban development. Furthermore, the parish of 320 dwellings, which it is at the moment, will be increased sixfold to some 1,840 dwellings, and picturesque rural landscape will be replaced by urban development. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that the people of Low Coniscliffe and Merrybent Council have had, by virtue of their neighbourhood plan, their say, and consider the allocation of land for housing as shown by the proposed local plan, known as Coniscliffe Park, to be so severe that no amount of mitigation could justify such development. And we would respectfully urge that the local plan be rejected because it does not sufficiently take account of the neighbourhood plan. I understand that we're talking about Samson versus Goliath here, but the point we're trying to make is this is our only opportunity for the people and the residents to have their say, and it is being disregarded almost entirely in the key areas. And we'd like, therefore, that the proposed local plan be reconsidered.
Okay, thank you very much. Understood. And we'll come back to that in the sense of the specific, the spatial strategy tomorrow, but also the specific allocations, the two allocations at Coniscliffe, and how they, what the rationale and the justification for those are. So thank you for that. Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much. On the topic of your musings earlier about the requirements for each area, would it be sensible potentially to make the housing requirement match that within the local plan, the neighbourhood plans, sorry, and any other development over and above that should then just be classed as strategic if required and needed, and we will be assessing that as a separate part of this these hearings. But that would solve the problem of if any major site were to fail for whatever reason, then the parish council having to be left to require to find another one, because it's clear that both of those neighbourhood plans have well evidenced work that's been done on their housing need, and they clearly do need whatever the minimum housing requirement is for each of them, and that would be sensible to list as the actual requirement.
Okay, thank you for that suggestion. I'm going to come back to the council in a moment once we've had the opportunities for others to have a say about this issue about. I don't want to get too into the discussion of the merits of allocations today because we're going to come back to those in some detail. It was really the principle of how the plan deals with the whole issue of what the national policy suggests it should do, which is setting out housing figures for parishes, where there's a neighbourhood plan area defined, and whether it's helpful or not to do that in the way that it's been done. I mean, I suppose the starting point is the plan is submitted, does it? It's a bit difficult for me to say it's unsound, given that the national policy suggests it should do it. So it may be that what I'm looking for is a creative way of, a bit like Councillor Holroyd suggested, sort of explaining properly and fully the basis for those figures and that they reflect the spatial strategy in the plan, and then not a requirement for each neighbourhood area to deliver those homes if the way that the plan itself is suggesting it be done doesn't materialise. I think that might be something that we need to think about. Okay, Mr. Baker.
Thank you, sir. I mean, obviously, local plans must set out the strategic policies, but they can also set out non-strategic policies. We're going to discuss, I think it's in matter 4 actually, the specific modification that the council's proposing to make in respect of making some sites strategic and some sites non-strategic. Is that correct, sir?
It is, isn't it?
Yes. So I don't think I won't get into that yet because I don't want to muddle things further. But I don't think I think we think that's the council's misinterpreted actually the meaning of strategic and non-strategic, and we think that that modification should be done away with entirely. But notwithstanding, the council is required as part of its strategic policies to identify a housing requirement for these neighbourhood areas. That's set out in paragraph 65 of the NPPF, and you've described the specific policy wording and the requirements to take into account the strategy within the local plan, not just sort of the allocations, but the strategy and the allocations. Now, just getting on, you'll see from our matter statement, our matter 1 statement, and that's set across pages 4, 5, and 6. We do discuss specifically the housing needs assessment that has prepared in Middleton St George, and given it sort of nearly 3 pages worth of critique, we won't go over that.
No, I read it.
You've read that. I mean, essentially, in our view, whilst it may be an arithmetic way of breaking down global numbers in a district down to a smaller geographic administrative area such as the borough, it's actually completely in conflict with national policy around what the strategic policies are required to do. So it doesn't accord with the NPPF or the PPG, and should therefore not be given weight in the way that's being asked and claimed at this session. I'd particularly just draw you to our bullet pointed conclusions on this matter at the top of our matter page, matter 1, page 6.
Yeah, understood. Yeah,
Thank you, sir.
Right, so just to be clear then, your preference is for the plan to do what NPPF and PPG tells it to do, which is include a table of figures with the numbers for the neighbourhood areas that reflects, as you put it, the strategy and the allocations in this plan. Yeah,
I think that's correct, particularly in a location where the council's topic paper has said that in respect of service villages, this is the ideal location for that growth, for all those sensible strategic planning reasons, not just because that's where the commitments are, that's where the allocations are, but actually those are sensitive strategic planning considerations that have went into that distribution. So I fully agree with that approach.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not going to get into the spatial strategy again yesterday, but there's a counter argument to that, which Middleton St George has had a lot of new homes built and committed in the last few years, and proportionate to the size of the population and the number of services in the village. One could say, well, actually, yes, there may be good reasons why that village has a level of services that's better than any other of the rural parts of the borough, but on the other hand, you could say, well, actually, it's done its share and it's had its amount of commitment in the recent years. you know, we'll leave that. We'll come back to spatial strategy and justification, but I don't want to get into that. Right. We're going to have a break fairly soon, but I'd quite like to finish neighbourhood plans maybe before we do, but I'll see how many other comments there are to make about neighbourhood plans. Mr. Madison.
Yes, I just wanted to touch on a couple of things, which probably has already been sort of mentioned, but the Low Coniscliffe plan, which has been approved, it's a publicly funded document. It's been approved by Darlington Borough Council, and it does seem to me, and obviously I'm a layperson, that it's being basically ignored in a lot of areas and a lot of facades. The land in question that's been talked about around Low Coniscliffe is an area of land that has featured in previous, I'll call them local plans. Clearly they were called something different in previous times, but all identified as being too difficult because of infrastructure and strategic issues to deal with. And strangely enough, once the farmer has relinquished the land, they now have featured in the local plan with absolutely no work done whatsoever to the area and the land to make it now feasible. So one of the questions that I'd like to know is literally how has it gone from being not feasible to now completely feasible, and then it comes into sustainability and comes into viability. And I haven't had an explanation as to that whatsoever. And I would just like to ask yourself, really, Mr. Fieldhouse, is what do you think the neighbourhood plan role or strength of that document actually is? Because if it's deemed to be worthless, then why has it actually been allowed to go down that line? And I assume it's national policy to be able to do that.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm not going to, I mean, in my report, I'll set out my conclusions and findings. There's national policy, which talks about the relationship in neighbourhood plans and local plans. Obviously, if a neighbourhood plan comes ahead of a local plan, the local plan isn't, I mean, the local plan is the strategic plan for the whole borough, and to some extent, it has to take a wider view than a neighbourhood plan does. So there's no absolute requirement for a local plan to just fit itself around every neighbourhood plan that happens to exist. Once a strategic plan's in place, neighbourhood plans have to be in general conformity with the strategic policies in the local plan. That said, when there's a recently made neighbourhood plan, as in the case here, the local planning authority is preparing a plan for the whole borough. National policy is clear that it should, you know, work closely with that neighbourhood area and you know, take account of that neighbourhood plan. But that doesn't mean that it's bound by it. So there is no absolutes here, I'm afraid. You know, okay, that's what I'd say in response to some what you put. Is there anything the council wishes to say about the housing numbers? I think a lot of what we're touching on is talking about really is about the strategy and the justification for the housing allocations. On reflection, is there anything further the council want to say about the table of figures and the text that goes with them? Fiona McCall.
Yes, can do, sir. I think it would just be we would have some concerns if the approach was to change to replace those figures with the housing needs assessment figures from the neighbourhood plan groups, because the guidance is clear that it's very much down to the local authority to set those figures, and it's only exceptionally when neighbourhood plan groups are sort of expected to provide their own figure where the local authority can't give them an indicative figure. So we would be concerned if we were looking at a replacement with those figures, and those figures are very much more proportioning a fair share to those neighbourhood plan areas based on their levels of population, and they don't reflect the spatial strategy of the plan, the settlement hierarchy or the housing needs that we have assessed. So we would have concerns with that. But just to clarify as well, in terms of the Low Coniscliffe and Merrybent neighbourhood plan, which was made in 2019, that is very much part of the development plan for the borough. It's not disregarded. It forms part of the plan and is a material planning consideration for planning applications. I think maybe where the concerns obviously arising from the Coniscliffe Park allocation, and to be honest, I think there is quite a lot of overlap between the neighbourhood plan for Lower Coniscliffe and Merrybend and the existing neighbourhood plan, the existing local plans, development plan and emerging local plan. A lot of the policies reflect national policy and key planning principles. So there is a lot of similarity between the documents. I think the difference is the concerns with the Coniscliffe Park application, the allocations. But just to clarify as well, that strategic allocation has been part of the plan process since its very early days in 2016. Sort of the issues and scoping stage, it was an area of strategic growth option, and the neighbourhood plan group were very much aware of that allocation, the proposed allocation there, and the council's aspirations to allocate that land for new housing growth. So just to clarify that point.
On that basis, then, what was the Borough Council's view at the examination of the neighbourhood plan, in the sense that the neighbourhood plan doesn't include those allocations in, obviously, as extensions to Darlington. I suppose the allocations do conflict with the neighbourhood plan, because the neighbourhood plan basically defines development limits, and it says anything outside there that's in this parish or in this neighbourhood plan area would be contrary to it. So there is some conflict there, is there not? I'm not saying that it's not legitimate, because as I said, the Borough Council, as strategic policymaker, has to deal with the needs of the borough in a sustainable way. But was that the council's position, or was it flagged up as an issue or not in the neighbourhood plan?
Yes, it was flagged up as a potential issue, in that we were proposing the strategic allocation and the emerging plan. However, I think the guidance is clear in that you assess the neighbourhood plan against the existing development plan of the time, and unfortunately at the time that was the core strategy and the 97 local plan. So the examiner for the neighbourhood plan assessed it against those documents and the development plan at the time. So he addressed it in terms of there could be potential conflict in the future, but that would be basically that would be a strategic site allocated by the local plan, and would in terms of that conflict, it would be the decision taker would take the policy from the most recently adopted part of the development plan, which would be the new local plan, and then the neighbourhood plan group may wish to review and update their neighbourhood plan accordingly after that.
Yeah, understood.
That's how it was dealt with.
That's clear enough and understood. And I think what you're saying is that in other respects, you've gone as far as you can to make sure that the local plan is consistent with the neighbourhood plan, including through the proposed changes to the development limits, which you've tweaked to sort of bring them into line with those in the neighbourhood plan, due for drafting errors or whatever on the submission policies map. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, it's brought in line to be in line with the neighbourhood plan now. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Right. Any other Councillor Gilson, and is there any further comment you want to make before we break?
Yes, thank you. Our neighbourhood plan has been drafted alongside the local plan, and obviously we had to include sites with planning permissions anyway. So it does include that amount of housing, even though our housing needs assessment assessed for much less than that. And what we don't agree with is the allocations for any more than that.
Yeah. Okay. Understood.
I would like to counter what Story Homes are saying with regard to our housing needs assessment, but only if you saying that's permissible at the moment.
Well, no, I understand. I've read it, and I've read what Story Homes say. Insofar, I mean, the point of contention, I think, what it comes down to is that allocation and the need for it in the village. So there's two ways we'll look at that, and I'm not going to dwell on it anymore today. One, whether the spatial strategy is right to direct more allocations to Middleton to St George, and we'll deal with that tomorrow. It is a sort of matter of principle in terms of the spatial strategy, distribution and development across the borough. And then in terms of the specific allocation, whether there's anything about the site that means that it's not suitable or it would be harmful to develop it. And we'll deal with that under matter 4 in the way that we'll deal with other allocations. So if we could leave that for now, understood. I just want to go back actually to Fiona McCall, just to leave something with you to think about. Is the careful explanation of the modification to what the figures mean in additional paragraph in the reason justification for policy H1, there's 2 paragraphs which clearly set out the justification for what the figures are. I just leave it with you to think about what the issue I raised earlier about unintended consequences of a site not coming forward that's reflected in those figures, what that may or may not mean for the Borough Council and how it may deal with it through a review of the plan rather than through having to release another site in that particular neighbourhood area. Is that something I could just leave with you? Is that clear enough in terms
Yes,
of?
yes. Yeah, that's fine, sir. We'll have a think and
I don't think
consider that a bit further.
Maybe when you read it through again, you think, oh, it's fine, it's clear. But if not, maybe it's just an opportunity to tweak the modification to provide clarity on that.
Yeah,
right.
No
We've dealt with the housing figures in the neighbourhood plans. They reflect what the plan allocates and is committed to. If my conclusions are that any allocations are not justified and would be taken out, clearly those figures would change. So that's the reassurance you'd get in terms of it wouldn't be, oh, we need to find another site in that parish necessarily. It would be up to the council to think about whether any additional land was needed. So we'll come back to those in due course. Just going back to where I started, sorry, is the categorising of policies that are strategic and non-strategic. That really is a matter of discretion, I think, for the local planning authority, and because of the way the NPPF and the PPG is written, it gives quite a lot of leeway really for the council to decide. And I think my reading is it's a reasonable balance that's been struck in identifying approximately half of them as strategic, and you can see the reasons why and others that aren't. So I'm broadly happy. I think we might come back to it, as Mr. Baker alluded to, in policy H2. H2 is described as a strategic policy, but within it, you've got strategic allocations and non-strategic allocations, which already confuses me, because it's hard to know itself what the plan's saying about all of those allocations. On one level, it's saying they're all strategic, on the other, they're not. So I think we'll park that for today, and we'll come back to it when we talk about that under matter 4, I think it is. But just before I break then, is there anything else that anybody wishes to say about the categorisation of strategic and non-strategic in the plan? I don't think anybody's actually picked up anything. I know in some other areas we've had some discussion about this, but it doesn't seem to be too contentious here. No, okay. Any final comments from the council then before we have a break? No, okay. Right, so it's 3:20 now. I think we'll have a break for 15 minutes. So if we could resume at 15:35, and then we've got one item left, which is viability, and we're going to talk not about the justification for the individual policies really, but about the viability assessment and the evidence for that, and any concerns that people have. And I just want to clarify a couple of things also about the site-specific viability assessments for the 2 largest strategic allocations that I mentioned this morning. Okay, so we'll break now and we'll resume in 15 minutes at 15:35, please. Thank you. Okay, well, it is 15:35, so we will resume now, if we could, please. So we're on to the last agenda item for this afternoon, which is viability. So the Council's Local Plan Viability Assessment, which is document CD08, provides the main evidence about the economic viability of the development proposed in the plan. But that was the culmination of a work that had been done during the preparation of the plan, and there had been earlier viability assessments carried out. But subsequent to that, I mean, referenced in that is that there would be site-specific viability assessments of the Greater Faverdale and Skirningham strategic allocations. So these were then published on the 7th of May, a little later than originally suggested, but that's when they were published. Having read those, I asked for some sort of clarification of them, and then there was a response to that published on the 18th of May. And I've had a follow-up question about that in the last few days. So there's been bits of information provided by the council in relation to its work on viability assessment. I'm not going to get into the detail of the sites today. We'll deal with those at the appropriate time later sessions. I want to understand, though, the viability assessment, the technical work that's been done, and any issues that there are with it, and to clarify a few things that it shows. I'm also aware that for the Skirningham site, there is a site-specific assessment provided by the site promoter, carried out by a consultancy, and that provides its own assessment of viability. And we won't talk about that today, but we will refer to that under the session when we're looking at that particular site under Matter 4. We can look at that evidence as well as the council's evidence for the viability of that particular site. So the first thing I just wanted to touch on, I think, is with the council, if I could please, is obviously there's RIC, there's quite a lot of guidance. There's NPPF clearly sets out a role for viability assessment at plan making stage, and the PPG provides quite a lot of information that was updated a number of times, but most recently in 2019. Subsequent to that, there's the RICS assessing viability and planning, which was published more recently. I think it was earlier this year, wasn't it? I can't remember exactly. But basically that says it builds on and takes the NPPF and the PPG as its starting point. It provides a bit more detail for RICS members. There's also other RICS guidance about conduct and reporting, etc., that is out there. So there's quite a lot of stuff to provide the sort of framework for the viability assessment. Just from the council's point of view, this work was done in-house. I mean, it was Mr. Simpson it said that he carried this work out, and he's got a senior role in the council, so that's fine. I suppose there's a similar question about I raised with the sustainability appraisal. What were the safeguards that were put in place to ensure this was in a sort of objective assessment done in the same way as there was? I raised that question for sustainability appraisal. So that's one question from Mr. Simpson. And secondly, the kind of is there any need for any of the work to be revisited in the light of the RICS assessing viability and planning that was published recently? So do you want to just comment on those two procedural points first?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the work I've done, you're right, it's an internal piece of work. All of the work's been drawn from independent sources, and it's an unfettered piece of work. If you'd notice in terms of some of the conclusions, they are actually some of the sites or some of the typologies are marginally viable. What I've done is researched a whole lot of different work from other locations. There's the National Planning Policy Framework, and obviously the PPG work as well. And open to challenges as anybody should see fit. In terms of your second question, in terms of having taken on board the most recent RICS guidance, I haven't as such, because it was actually published after my work was completed. Therefore, it hasn't been taken on board.
Presumably you've looked at that, have you? RICS, that assessing viability and planning?
Yeah, I've reviewed it, but I think David Hand would like to comment in terms of it, if that's okay, because I think it's this is maybe something that he'd like to comment on.
Okay, I mean, I'm not making a big thing. I think it was raised by Story Homes, suggesting that, you know, is there anything significant that would change if you went through that document and looked at the CD08 approach again? I've not identified anything, but, you know, Mr. Hand, do you want to just comment on that?
Yeah, just as part of the approach, right from an early stage, we did consult with the industry to check that the assumptions were, you know, basically agreeable, that the assumptions that John was going to use as part of the scheme when doing the assessment. And I think John might be able to come back, but I think they didn't really receive any negative feedback.
Okay, well, yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Carry on, Mr. Simpson.
So yeah, I was going to say, no, we didn't receive any negative feedback. We received some information that we took on board in terms of things like benchmark land values. There was a range of sort of comments. Unfortunately, I think there's an element of confliction between some developers in terms of the comments. However, we took on board wherever possible the comments to sort of add independence to the work.
Okay, thank you. I noted some of the things that were updated in the appraisal. As I said, that the appraisal published in December 2020 was a revised version of earlier. So there was iterations of the appraisal that helped to inform the plan. And that was an appraisal that was done of the plan as submitted, taking account of some of the assumptions that people had suggested in response to the Reg 19. So I was aware of that. I'll pick up on some of those. What I wanted just to double check there was something about the addendum for the strategic sites, and the two sort of follow-up questions I had in relation to that, just to make sure I understand what those are showing and how it relates to the methodology in the CD08. Just to take a step back, obviously the PPG and the RICS guidance sets out a residual land value approach to assessing viability in plan making. And in simple terms, that's about estimating the total value of development and the total costs, including infrastructure, and meeting the policy requirements. You take away the cost from the value, and that leaves a residual land value, which can then be compared to a benchmark land value, which is itself based on existing use value plus a premium that would incentivise a willing landowner to sell their land. And that would vary between whether it's a greenfield agricultural site and how much an uplift they'd look for, as opposed to whether it was, say, a brownfield site or whatever. So there's a lot of kind of analysis and assumptions that have to be made, but that's the kind of basic approach. And that's what you did in CD08, I think, and it's summarised in the methodology section. All understood. Fine, thank you. This addendum in relation to the two strategic sites, on the face of it, hence my follow-up questions, seemed to take not a different approach, but presented in a different way. It didn't easily set out to me what the residual land value was, hence my question that you answered promptly, and we've got published, and I've got the figures now. But actually that got me thinking a bit more about taking a step back. So going back to CD08 and the benchmark land values, the first thing I'll just have a little moan here: acres and hectares. Hectares, please, and certainly don't mix and match. On that, I think CD08 is almost exclusively written in terms of metric measurements, square metres and hectares. And actually, when I looked at Table 9, which sent out the benchmark land values, I assumed it was pounds per hectare. But as you are shaking your head and you're now confirming to me, when I read your response, I realised it wasn't, which is a bit odd in the sense that the whole of that document does seem to be about hectares and metric measurements, and even the comparators that you refer to in the preceding paragraphs in Durham and Sunderland, Newcastle, North Tyneside and Stockton all seem to be expressed in hectares. So that was a bit confusing, I'll say. But anyway, I've got the figures now for the benchmark land values in hectares, because I think you either provided them or Gillingham Estates provided them in terms of the translation of that. So just to be clear, can I make sure I've got them right? For the high value areas of the borough, the benchmark land value is 618. This is rounded, 618,000 per hectare. Yep. 494,000 for the medium and 371,000 for the low value. Rounded, yeah, thank you. I always round things. I'm not a surveyor or a mathematician. I like rounding numbers. Now, the next thing that got me thinking when you responded to it, you talk about net, the residual land value and benchmark land value being on the net developable area. Now, I just need to explore this a little bit. Benchmark land value is based on existing use value, yeah, plus an uplift. So if you've got a site, whether it's the whole Skirningham 490 whatever hectares or something smaller, that whole site has to be, the owner of that site, whether it's one person or more, have to be incentivized to sell it. Different bits of the land, if you broke it down, will have different development values, presumably, but it's releasing the whole area that matters, is it not? And its existing use may be more than one, or it may be all agricultural, woodland, or whatever. So isn't the basic approach that it's the gross area that the benchmark land value relates to?
I mean, it can. I mean, it's somebody who acquires a site may acquire the site, but they actually may only pay based on a net developable area, as in there may be a corner of a site that's not really developable. Therefore, the land value might be based on what they can develop net, but they will pay for the, generally for the whole site. I anticipate this question. I've looked at one of the more recent transactions relating to land in Darlington. It's for the West Park site, and just to compare, it's relatively recent. It's the gross to net values, because the purchaser was in Armstrong. They bought land on Mount Pleasant Farm. They paid approximately £400,000 gross per hectare. £239,000 gross. But once you net it down to the sort of net developable area, approximately 60%, it's about £399,000 per net hectare. So the way you value land may be based on gross, but actually they want to be based on the gross to net ratio. So I agree with your point, but in terms of local comparators, that's a recent local comparator.
Yeah. I'm fully aware that any individual site, its value will depend on how much of it you're going to develop, and it'll depend on a whole lot of other things. But in terms of a consistent approach to viability assessment across a whole range of typologies, is what you did in CDO8, and indeed to be consistent the way you look at these strategic sites, surely the benchmark land value would surely relate to the gross area, would it not? Because the existing use value relates to that, and then you uplift it.
It could be translated the other way, but generally I've applied this across the piece in terms of the approach to net developable area. But I think it would happen in other areas as well.
But the way that you work out the actual the residual land value factors in assumptions about net to gross, doesn't it? Densities and all those different things, as well as all the different costs and all those sort of things. So you end up with whatever the size of the site was in gross terms. The value of it, the residual value of it, takes account of all that stuff.
That's it. The residual value is everything. All incomes, all receipts, after deducting all costs, except for land. So you're right. That it does factor in the gross site. However, I agree. A developer would acquire the gross site, but it would pay a value for the site, and the residual value could be more or less. So my viability appraisal demonstrates in some cases it's more, in some cases less. But you're right. It's in terms of the residual valuation method, it would be a case of the net amount after all costs would be the residual value.
But I'm just trying to understand what the benchmark land value should be. Your values are actually quite high compared to some of the comparators that you referred to. Or well, I suppose they're comparable, aren't they? But in CDO8, you don't explain whether they are for gross or net. I suppose my question is, for the purposes of CDO8 and the typologies of sites, some of which small sites you may assume 100% developed or 95 or something. Some of the larger sites, presumably the proportion goes down. But for benchmark land values, in terms of what you've said are appropriate based on an uplift to existing use value, this is table 9, are they gross or net?
Net, based on net developable area. in terms of for each of the typologies. So the way it works it out is it would be the on some of the larger sites, it'd be 60% of the site.
If you've got the same, the benchmark land value is independent of each assessment of the different typologies, isn't it? It's just there as a reference point for benchmark land value.
I think I know what you're saying. At the bottom of each of the appraisals, I think it shows the land value per acre. But yeah, I think it does. But yeah, I think this is, unless I'm misleading myself, it's an industry standard approach to deal with land values.
I mean, it may be that if those are your benchmark land values and you apply them consistently, I don't think how they can be applied consistently if you've got different gross to net density assumptions for different size sites and things. But right, I don't know. Maybe we just need to have a think about that. I mean, the reason I ask that is obviously when you express the residual land value for the 2 strategic sites, you tell me that they are nearly 542,000 for Skirningham, yeah, residual land value, and 500.
So I think it might be. I think you're misleading that. It's in millions, I think.
No, this is per hectare. Sorry, Dan.
Sorry, yes. Yeah, that's
yeah.
okay.
You say that's per net developable hectare.
Yes.
But if you divided the 490 hectares into your what's the residual value? 80 million for Skirningham, yeah? You'd get a quite different residual land value, wouldn't you? For the gross, it would be then gross.
So I'm not quite sure what you mean. Is in terms of the.
Right. Sorry, let me take Skirningham as an example. You say that the residual land value for the whole site, 492 hectares or whatever it is 80 million thereabouts, 79 something million, yeah?
Yeah.
That's the figure you provided, isn't it?
Yes.
79,800,000, let's call it 80 million, yeah?
Yeah.
For the sake of argument. So you've got that is the value, the residual value for the full, and if you then divide that by the full number of hectares, you get a different answer to whether you divide it by what you've done to get the 541, yeah? Because you've divided it by, I don't know what, not 400, sorry, it's 487 hectares, isn't it? Gross.
So I'm just looking at it. So 487 hectares, did you say?
I think so. That's what the gross figure in the plan is.
Yeah, it's a lower level.
Yeah, it's 164,000 or something like that on gross.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking this is, like, I'm not saying what the conclusion would be. I just wanted to see what is the fair figure to compare with what you say are appropriate benchmark land values, and I'm not clear in my own mind. And
I think you're saying that each of the sites will have a slightly different value based on the way it's calculated. As in the value for each site wouldn't be necessarily equate to exactly the benchmark land value that's been published.
No, because there might be very good reasons for that. I.e., you wouldn't achieve that benchmark land value for this particular site. And I think this is what's alluded to in the Skirningham Estates viability assessment. They say whatever they estimate the benchmark land value to be, they say, well, actually a site like this, you wouldn't necessarily expect to achieve that because of the high infrastructure costs up front and blah, blah, blah. So you'd actually, a willing landowner would accept they're not going to get the same uplift as it would be necessarily if it was a different sort of site. So that's a different sort of highway. I'm just trying to get the kind of facts set up so I know what I'm comparing with like for like. I think we'll leave it for today, and it may be that I'll just ask you to, provide a little note of clarification as to what a fair comparator would be in terms of the methodology. I mean, I suppose going back to your CD08 originally, in your little table 9, you've got the figures for the benchmark land values, and I know you adjusted those to take account of, I think it was Miller Homes, wasn't it, suggestion? So we may get comments from them. I don't know, are we here to say? Anyway, but you changed those, and then you've put a column in, which is multiple of EUV. Yeah? 25, 20, 15. I don't think in CDO8 you've defined what the EUV is, though. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying in terms of how has it come to the 25. I've used a benchmark of £10,000 per acre generally on greenfield sites, but I agree it's probably not clear in the table how it's been calculated.
Yeah, very helpful. So, and then presumably, did you say acre then?
So yeah, it was, but it was that's what that table said. It was in acres. I apologise. So it's it should have been presented in hectares.
Yeah. But anyway, but you've got evidence to justify an existing use value for a greenfield site in Darlington, I'm sure, and I don't think that has been disputed. So existing use value, probably it just needs to be set out what it is, and then you've then said, well, if you take these benchmark land values, these represent uplifts of 25, 20, 15, and that's a judgment as to whether that would incentivise a landowner to sell their site. And that's a judgment, and you can talk about that. And yeah, okay, right. So I'll leave that with you for today, but we'll come back to it. It's just I just wanted to flag it up so that when we come back to talk about the reason this is important is not because the evidence, your evidence, and the others does seem to suggest these sites are viable. What I think may be up for some discussion is the extent to which they're comfortably viable or not, and the implications that potentially could have on some of the quite significant things that are expected to be delivered to support the housing development that the plan is proposing, and the difference that could make in terms of achieving sustainable development or not. Because the way this plan is set up, and I think is almost inevitable, is if things become more challenging in terms of viability, the things that tend to get compromised are some of the policy requirements in the plan, the infrastructure provision that's expected, etc., which could then have quite significant knock-on effects in terms of the quality and the sustainability of the development in the long run. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, we've got to do it. Yes, to do so. I think. Yeah,
it's not so much. It's just making sure I understand the margin there is here in terms of viability and the ability that the plan has to be actually delivered in the way it's saying it's going to be delivered. Okay, so I'll leave that for now. We'll come back to that issue in terms of those particular sites when we talk about the particular sites. And the other evidence we've got about the sort of the margins and whether we can achieve those things. So let me just pause there for 1 sec, and then we'll come back to some of the more technical and methodological questions about the general approach to the local plan viability assessment, if we could. Right, okay. So the approach you took, you factored in all of the policy requirements in the plan, and they're all the policies are listed, and you've got figures against those. They can be, if anyone's going to challenge those or discuss those, they can. You've got evidence for those, and there's a rationale for it. We'll come on to some of the specifics I've picked up, and there may be others. One of the things that someone, I can't remember who referenced, was that's fine. We've talked about it this morning or this afternoon, I can't remember which, but there may be other things that are hidden away in SPD, for example. I don't think this is a big issue, but for example, there is, the old design SPD and the Code for Sustainable Homes, energy efficiency sort of thing. They weren't factored in, were they?
No, not so.
No. Okay, fine. That's and your colleagues may say, well, that's fine because they wouldn't be applied and we wouldn't be asking for them. But I just wanted to be clear about that, and others may have a view about it. Right. What about future building regs changes? There's been reference to, these could increase energy costs quite considerably for the quality of homes, energy, the requirements. Sensitivity testing or anything, assumptions made about those? What would you say?
No, it hasn't been done. I mean, we haven't assumed anything other than what's currently known and in place. So you're right, that could affect any future changes could affect viability.
So what does that tell us then? That you do sensitivity tests to see what your margins are like?
Well, the sensitivity tests are predominantly on the impact of affordable housing.
Yeah, okay.
There are other tests that could be done, but it's quite easily done. For example, there's an assumption that if the sites are sort of marginally viable, the developer might take a marginal hit on profit on gross development value. Therefore, we've assumed, or have assumed throughout, that 20% on profit gross development value is the norm. However, it is acceptable to go below that. Therefore, there is scope within the potential sensitivity to get further costs in, but that would be considered something which would necessitate a reduction in GDV profits.
Yeah, okay. So, what about though the margin that you've got in terms of when you make a judgment about the difference between, going back to it's a residual land value approach, you compare it with the benchmark land value, you know, if the residual land value is above the benchmark land value, you get a green score. Presumably the bigger the gap, the more you know, there's a cushion there. What's it looking like across the piece in terms of the typologies?
In terms of the typologies, generally the high value sites come out as viable. I'll just quickly go to the report. I think it's on page 67 of the report, but it's in the lower value areas generally, and particularly brownfield sites, that's considered not viable. In the medium value areas, where I think a lot of the allocated sites are, it's considered viable or marginally viable. When I say marginally viable, based on sort of known or estimated costs and values, a developer would be able to generate a profit of around 20% profit on GDV.
Yeah, but okay, I've got the table 10 summary of residential viability testing on page 69 of your report, and for the high value areas, all the typologies come out green. But what I don't have there is whether they are like, you know, 2% above the benchmark land value, or they're 50%, or they're double the benchmark land value. And there's no, where would I look at that if I wanted to?
It's in Appendix A to the, so it should be in Appendix A to the report. What should I say? So I'll just quite quickly look again. Appendices A to F, but it's Appendix A.
These great big tables of figures.
That's right. These are the detailed development appraisals showing all the sensitivity done in terms of the different levels of affordable homes assumptions. It's actually detailed costs and values. So that's where everything is in terms of information. There's about 69 appraisals in terms of
this is the problem, Mr. Simpson, I have, in the sense that, you know, I think the PPG and the RICS go quite a long way to try and say, look, this is all very complex, and simple people like me have to be able to understand it, and I'm struggling. And I suppose what would help is a table 10 version that had some indication of what marginal and viable mean. And I mean, presumably you could put a figure in for each of these, however many typologies there are. When it's green, you could say whether it's double the benchmark land value, or it's 2% over the benchmark land value, or whatever, couldn't you?
I could. I mean, I'm more than happy to share that with you. You're right. I mean, it would be much clearer if you understood how viable things are.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then
that's, I think, that's what
if I'm worrying about, you know, a few £100 extra for electric vehicle charging points or whatever, you know, I don't worry about it, because I know that you double your benchmark land value or whatever, and you know it's not going to make a significant difference. What I don't know from this is, you know, you know, it's the cumulative cost of the policy requirements that add up, and each of them may not be massive, but you know, affordable housing is usually the biggest one. It's you know that. So I'll have a think. I may ask you to do a revised table 10 that puts in some sort of indication of the comfort of the viability cushion, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, yes,
right.
So thank you. What I was just pointing to, as I say, is that it is actually in the appendices exactly what the cushion is. But yes, right, it's not being clearly reflected in the narrative of the report. So
it's not difficult for you to do. It's difficult for me to do. Therefore, it's better for you to do it than me to do it, because I'd get it wrong probably. Right. Okay. Right. In terms of the next question, you've already alluded to this, and I picked out. You looked at all the Reg 19 representations and the suggestions that you made about the assumptions, and you did some further work, and that's reflected in CDO8. So if I look back at the Reg 19 rep, some of those issues have, from your point of view, have been addressed. Yeah. So they include, you did some more detailed typology appraisals. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah. The affordable housing tenure split, you altered that to reflect what was in the plan, or to reflect the NPPF, because there's been a modification to that now, hasn't there, which has changed the tenure split again for some of the value areas, I think.
I think Matthew Usher might want to respond to this one. Sorry.
Okay. I'll just go through my little list, and if there's anything you want to say, and then I'll see if there's anything else. Yeah. Accessible and adaptable homes has been assessed now at the 47% rather than the higher rate that it was originally, I think, hasn't it?
Yes.
You changed the assumptions about normal costs to take account of some suggestions, yeah?
Yes, I mean, I think the highest level of abnormal costs now is applied to brownfield sites, which is at 10%, but the range we've applied, I think is between 2 to 10%, depending on typology.
Yeah. So you've got up to 10% for brownfield, yeah? And then there's contingencies on top of that, yeah?
Yes, I mean, I think it's for brownfield, it's 5% for brownfield, but I think the range goes from 3 to 5 for contingencies.
Yeah.
Again, but brownfield is the highest.
Okay. The credit rate, you adjusted that, yeah?
Yes, I mean, again, the financing of these things is often quite complex based on cash flow and when houses are actually sold. But the credit rate is 6%. I think the debit was set at 1. I think with again taking on board the comments received. I think. Yeah,
I don't pretend to understand what it means, but I mean,
so it's the other way.
Yeah, okay. But if you change it, it makes a significant difference to the sort of the value and when.
Yes, so.
Okay, right, and the benchmark land values we've already talked about. You adjusted those again to reflect comments, I think, from Miller Homes and possibly others about that. Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, did Mr. Usher want to say about the affordable housing tenure split and the
yes,
the modification that came after the viability appraisal update, did it not?
It was just to say no, that the viability appraisal update takes account of the proposed modified affordable housing tenure split modification. So it's the approach taken is consistent with the proposed modification.
So that's 100% home ownership in the low value areas, 50% medium and 35 high. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
And those modification was to reflect the NPPF suggestion that you should go for 10% of total housing on a site as being affordable home ownership. Yeah.
Yeah. That modification was to ensure that the tenure split in policy H5, I think it is consistent with NPPF. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, right. Okay. Fine. So that's then. So everything in the plan is reflected in the CDO8. Appraisal. Right. I'll let the HBF and others have a say in a minute, but I did pick up a couple of things from HBF about three things. One was the assumptions about dwelling sizes not being clear because you've applied averages across the typologies of dwelling types. Do you want to just comment on that?
So that's right. So we have, but they are relatively high to the say the published minimum space standards. I think Homes England published them, but we're right. They are higher than minimum space standards.
So all of the assumptions you make about all of the different house types, they all meet the minimum space standards.
Yeah, on average, yes. I think we have regular conversations with Homes England about space standards, but yes, there's an assumption that the average house size is greater than the minimum.
Right. Biodiversity net gain. You used some government figures from 2017. Do they need to be adjusted to inflation, or would it make much difference?
Matthew, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I mean, we feel that they're appropriate basis to incorporate into the appraisal. The assumptions are the most robust that are available to us to use at this stage, and we feel broadly reflect the costs that we would expect to see applied to development. So we feel that they're appropriate to use.
And the issue of adjusting for inflation from 2017, would that make a significant difference or not?
I think it's unlikely. John may be able to add to it, but I think it's unlikely it would make any significant difference to the overall calculations.
Well, like to be, I think no, we don't think we have an immediate material impact on things, but no, I agree with Matthew.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Right, and finally, the electric vehicle charging points. A nominal cost was assumed, whereas the suggestion is that actually government consultation suggests it's around £1,000. It could be more depending on the particular circumstances of the site.
I think it's, yes, sorry, sir, if I can respond to that one. I think it's important to clarify what the actual requirement is that's set out in policy IN4. It doesn't require the provision of a electrical vehicle charging point per se. Within footnote 71 of that policy, it specifies that the minimum requirement would be basically a standard single phase 13 amp socket that would be suitably located. So that would be a very nominal additional cost that could be absorbed within the overall sort of build cost that's factored in. So there's no need to make an allowance for that amount given the nominal nature of what the minimum requirement is of the policy.
Okay, so it's just a plug in your garage or on your
That's
drive.
correct, yes, yeah.
But what then, I mean, presumably, what's why is the government consulting on this, and why are they referring to this figure? Presumably because they're thinking about introducing something more, yeah?
Well, the charging points provide a higher, I mean, not a technical expert on these, but they provide a higher voltage that would allow you to charge your vehicle quicker, so that the single basic plug that the minimum requirement for the policy is just a standard plug that would take a longer period of time to charge. So obviously there would be additional costs associated with the provision of a charging point that the government are consulting on, but that's not what the minimum requirement of the policy is here. So we haven't factored that into our appraisal.
Okay, understood. So the requirement isn't for that. If the requirement had been for that in the plan, you'd have probably factored it in. If that comes along with other requirements through the building regs or whatever else, yes, they would impact on viability because they're adding to the costs that you've identified, which comes back to me wanting to know what the comfort is in terms of the cushion between viable development and very viable development, or just marginally viable development, I think. Right, because obviously, you know, these things can change and will change, won't they, as building regs and other standards change. Right, thank you for that. I'll just pick up on another issue about the definition of the value areas. There's lots of different ways you could do that. A couple have suggested that based on wards, it's too broad brush, particularly when their site may be, in their perception, you know, different bits of it having different value, and therefore wanting a more nuanced approach, presumably because then that would change the affordable housing requirement for the site in the plan. So leaving aside the implications of it, is there a logic for taking the ward-based approach to value areas?
If I take that one, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, we feel that taking the ward-based approach enables a better, broader, robust average to be provided to ensure that the average that's incorporated into the appraisal is one that is more robust than doing it on a more localized specific basis, where the amount of new residential build sales that there may not be as of a larger amount. So you don't get that more robust average that you get by taking the ward-based approach. That also factors in the range of types of sites that you get by taking a more locally specific approach. You may pick up the specific characteristics of a neighbourhood where that site might not actually sit within that neighbourhood if it's an urban fringe site, for example. So by taking the ward-based approach, it gives that more wider, robust evidence that we can factor into the appraisal.
And looking at the map in Appendix E of the plan, simple diagram, it breaks down the borough into three, low, medium and higher value areas. I mean, just a common sense sort of sense check on that. I don't think anyone's particularly pointed out that it looks wrong. You step back and you think about that. Does that reflect the kind of the common sense view of Darlington, the borough, and any observation on that? I mean, others can have a say, but I mean, you've got no concerns from the council point of view that's come up with a kind of illogical kind of breakdown.
Could I answer that one as well, please? We've done a detailed analysis of sales values across these areas. So the low, medium, high value areas, relatively speaking, reflect the values achieved in these areas in sales. Therefore, we feel it's a logical approach. I think most people would recognise these areas more or less as fitting into these sort of typologies. So it's an evidence-based approach, really. But you're right. Some sites will cross more boundaries, but generally, I'm hoping that people would believe that reflects the areas in the town values.
I suppose two things about that. One, obviously, if you use a boundary, you can come up with a factually correct average sales value in that area, and that'll come out as it's come out. I suppose the question is, does that boundary make sense on the ground, sort of thing, generally, in the sense that it reflects a kind of geographical reality there, or was there some other geographical breakdown that you could have done either bigger or smaller that would make more sense? I think what you're saying is this makes sense. Obviously, there's different ways you could do it, but this is a way of doing it, and factually it's correct. Anyway, well, just going back to Mr. Usher, the way that the policy is framed, if a site were to straddle a high and a low, or a low and a medium, or whatever, what does the policy say for affordable? The only policy that differentiates, I think, is the affordable housing requirement, yeah?
Yes, that's the only policy that I'm aware of that differentiates between high, medium and low value areas.
And what does the policy say will be applied? Does it say that the higher value or the medium value, or if it straddles, or is it the biggest part of the site, or is it do you break it down, or what's the council's approach?
I don't think the policy, in all honesty, specifies that. I think the logical approach would be to apply that the majority of the site sat within in the first instance, but clearly, there would be the opportunity for a site-specific viability appraisal. So if there was a unique site, of that nature, then it could be something that would be looked at through that at the application stage.
If I want a plan-led system as far as possible and avoiding the need for individual viability assessments, should the plan be clearer on what the approach would be if a site straddles a ward boundary like this, so that at least people know what the starting point is in terms of affordable housing? You say you think you'd take the majority of the site. Well, yeah, okay, you may think that, but the developer may take a different view, might they? They may say, well, hang on, no. Yeah.
It's something we can definitely look at, sorry, sir. Yes, yeah, it's, that we can make clear. It's something we can go away and have a think about, if that's okay.
I guess, it comes back a bit to do with the margins and the viability here, because, if there's a lot of flex in there for the medium value areas, the high value areas, maybe you can say, yeah, so long as the majority of the site's there. So have a think about it, if you could, as to what the implications might be and what and the clarity it would. I know others will want to have a say on that. But going back to what the viability assessment shows us, it does show us that the residential and low value areas is not viable, and brownfield sites and marginal in medium and high value areas. You've presented to me an analysis of actually what the allocations in the plan are and how they relate to the typologies. I think what you're saying is that, well, it doesn't matter, the fact that that's what the viability assessment shows, because we're not relying on those marginal brownfield sites in low value areas or whatever. You've given me an explanation of the ones that fall within the potential typologies that the viability is questionable, and you're saying, look, even those we're confident will come forward because they're council owned or this, that, and the other. So just so I understand it, notwithstanding the fact that what the viability shows in theory, the allocations in the plan you're confident will be delivered because of the nature of them. Yeah.
That's correct, sir. Yes, as set out in our written statement, all sites in the low value area are council-owned sites, which will be brought forward for affordable housing. So we, as we've set out, not going into any further detail, that we agree that's what we've said. Yes.
Okay. And the extent to which the brownfield windfall sites in low value areas, say, coming forward. Again, it's not a concern. It's not that there's, there's an assumption that to meet your housing needs, and some say you should, to meet your housing needs, you're not relying on a lot of urban brownfield sites coming forward. Presumably, if that were to take place, the council would be very happy with it, but you're not relying on that in terms of meeting housing needs. Windfalls, brownfield windfalls, you're not relying on them. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Sorry to give you a bit of a intensive questioning, but that's helped me. Although I think now there may be some others that will want to have some make some points and ask some questions. So I'll open it up. Sorry, unless there's anything else on viability generally in terms of what we've talked about with the council wishes to say before I go to Mr. Hall and others. No. Right, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, sir. I'm reassured actually by all of that questioning, because that proves you've read my statement.
I always read your statement, Mr. Hall.
I know, but we've read it in some detail, because I think the site you're talking about might be the one I'm acting on. So, but I'll just draw your attention to paragraph 116, 1.16 of our statement. So, but I think you've been through all of these now, but I'll make the overarching point then that I think you've alluded to, that we think there are various, I know you've just been through what's been, if you like, added to the assessments. There are various policy requirements that either haven't been costed or the full implications of them have not been factored in. So I think I've just been told they've now put part M4 standards in, but we've also made the point it feels a bit like Bellway are being penalised because they haven't yet got a consent, that they're making up the shortfall in the M4 standard homes, because it does clearly say it'll have to be the sites that go on to secure consent that will, if you like, deliver the extra. But then there's the significant costs of the M43, which have we been told they've been factored in, which we think are 25,000 a dwelling. Then you picked up on it earlier, but there's these loose references, like there's the energy, the out of date SPD does talk about on-site energy provision, which would attract a cost, could do in the future. Electric charging points, we did put a figure of 1,000 in our statement, which you've now mentioned. I mean, I think there is just a related point that it's not always just as simple as adding the plugs, the points, because you do have to be able to deliver the electricity supply on the development and the infrastructure and the substation, etc. But also, having looked into it myself, if you just use a standard point, you have to charge overnight, like all night. Whereas I think we appear to be moving towards the quicker charging points. And then, of course, now we are all looking at biodiversity net gain, which I'm rightly, not arguing the principle necessarily, but there are significant costs. I have dealt with sites in Darlington where we're now having discussions about either paying money towards this or providing additional land. And I think if you then if you jump back to my paragraph 1.5, that is, I think that's where you've got the idea of a site being split over 2 wards. And I do probably think this is one of the better examples in Darlington, because we have, without going into too much detail or to anything too sensitive, but we have Great Burden Village to the north, but we have the Red Hall estate to the south. So we would argue they are medium and low value. So and if you read the policy detail, which we can come on to in the session, I'm happy to pick it up again under the allocation, but there is let's just say there's a fair proportion of the housing in what we consider to be the low value area. Set against what I've just said, you know, it's a delicate balance. I mean, we are saying we will deliver the site, but we just want to be sure it's a robust and transparent appraisal, really, of viability.
Okay, some of those things I think has already been addressed. I'll come back. The council can make a note of just a few other things to pick up. The 25,000 for the wheelchair adaptable homes. So just double check at the end whether that's been
dwelling, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, of course, per dwelling, yeah. I think the other issues we've dealt with, just in terms of a site straddling the boundary and the amount of development that would be in what you'd perceive to be a lower value area rather than a higher value area. Is your reading of the plan, we can come back to this when we look at the affordable housing policy, but just to sort of flag it up, that you don't know, do you, which affordable housing requirement would be applied, or do you? Is the plan clear, I suppose, is the question?
Well, I mean, I do know because I've been involved on and off for years on the site, but it's likely to be the higher figure that we're asked for is the point. So you've hit the nail on the head, because I'm not sitting here saying we want to deliver less of something or more of something else, but the consequence of all of this in reality is there's pressure on affordable housing. I think you said that 10 minutes ago, didn't you?
Yeah.
Effectively. And I'm not, you know, what I would rather we did was, you know, either adjust, as long as people know we're balancing these things. So if we adjust the M4, for example, because it's gone downwards, hasn't it? We've suggested it may, you know, why that figure, could it have gone? Can these things be adjusted still? But particularly where a site is being suggested, you know, the nature of that site, we would suggest it would be more justified coming in at the low value, or splitting it. We've really said, haven't we? So.
Yeah, but that would be split.
It's a big enough site to split in value terms.
But it would be split not both. It's not that it straddles a ward, is it? It straddles a super output area, which in reality is saying reflects, you know, different levels of market value. Yeah. So it wouldn't help you because this site falls within a medium or high value area, does it?
It's medium. Sorry, medium. But we're saying some of it should be low to simplify it. And we think it's big enough to be able to do that. I mean, I won't sort of keep repeating the same point, but we do think that. I mean, I understand about averaging data for wards and everything else. I've done loads of that through my career, but it is genuinely a lower value area to the south, and you can physically, you know, it's possible to split the site and phase it and all the rest of it. But I think they were the main points, and I know there's been much debate about these other EIPs as well, including the one with yourself. So I don't want to go on and on about electric charging points. Sure, we had half an hour on it at Durham, didn't we?
I think we did. Yeah, okay.
The government just needs to come out and make a statement on that, I think, soon, and we'll all know what type and what they cost.
Well, it comes back a lot
to the problem, isn't it? The fluid nature of evolving policy regime nationally.
Well, it does, and I think that's why I'm anxious to know what the margin is in the council's own viability assessment, as the extent to which there's some comfort in these things that are flagged as green as being viable. Is what actually do the figures show us? Is there some flex there, Mr. Baker?
Thank you, sir. I mean, you have raised some of the points that my client wished to raise. So, for example, Part L of the building regulations, and as we've established, that isn't something that's been taken into account directly. But you know, that's why this cushion is all the more important to ascertain. I mean, from a starting point, the sites that Story Homes are promoting are viable, and we've obviously done our own calculations and looked at the policies and the requirements. But of course, Stories does have additional interest in and around the borough, so it is important that this matter is dealt with. I mean, another issue, and perhaps it's a question that could be put to the council, is there seems to be revenues do seem to be adjusted for inflation going forward, but costs don't seem to be. So it would be useful to have a clarification on that. We also raise additional points about profit and benchmark land value, which we're just happy to rely on our written statements in our Matter 1 statement. So I won't go over that further, sir.
Okay. Okay. Well, I have read those, and then I can look back at those. Right. Joanne Harding, do you want to comment, please?
Thank you. Yeah, I think you've raised most of what I said in my hearing statement, so thank you for that.
Okay.
But my key point really at the end of the day is the need to make sure these homes are delivered, and the need for I think basically a cautious approach in terms of the viability. As has been mentioned, we do have quite a lot in terms of the building regs coming forward, and the potential implications in terms of energy efficiency, the future home standard, electrical vehicle charging points. And the significant impact that those together could have on the electrical network, and therefore the additional costs that are potentially associated not just with the actual building regs coming forward, but also with that impact in terms of the electrical capacity and the improvements needed to make it all happen. So I think that's all sort of worth bearing in mind when we're looking at that buffer. And obviously the point you raised yourself earlier on in terms of the calculations in terms of the benchmark land values and the net areas, and the particular implications that might have for some of the larger sites, where that could have some significant differences in terms of the costs and overall residual values. So I think it is just a cautious approach, making sure that those values are appropriate going forward. I also did have some concerns that I know that they're saying that the low value areas are council owned, but also in terms of the council's own requirements in terms of most efficient and best value in terms of those land sales, and the implications that could also have for them as a council. So again, as I say, it's just really a note of caution, I think, going forward, making sure the homes can actually happen.
Yeah, okay. So, like me, have you not crawled through all Mr. Simpson's appendices to find out what these buffers are for the viable sites typologies?
I have tried. I did actually try and make a little chart to show me what they were.
You didn't submit it?
No, sorry.
Because you didn't like what it said, or because you weren't happy with how accurate you weren't?
I was just a bit like yourself. I was just slightly cautious that I wasn't interpreting it necessarily correctly. So I have my fingers crossed that it's going to look similar when Mr. Simpson has done it.
Okay, thank you. Seriously on that, is there a simple way it should be presented in terms of percentage over the benchmark land value? What's the best way to express it in your experience?
I do like the colour. I do like the colours. So, but personally, I tend to find the numbers easier than a proportion. So I'd rather see sort of how much money there is left in the pot, almost, so you know, as a developer coming forward, when you're looking at the additional costs of things like the building regs going forward, sort of how much money is left in the pot to allow for those things.
So could that be expressed in pounds per hectare? Surplus or something like that?
Yes.
Okay. So you could express it either as a percentage over benchmark land value, the residual land value, or pounds per hectare over benchmark land value.
Yeah.
And you like the latter?
Yes, I think I'd rather have the pounds per hectare rather than the proportion, personally.
And I hesitate to do this, but do you have any view about whether the benchmark land values assumed in CDO8 relate to gross or net developable area?
I would have assumed that the benchmark land values were the gross area until you mentioned earlier. It hadn't crossed my mind that that it wasn't.
No, I assumed it would be gross, and that's what surprised me when I read the fact that when Mr. Simpson had calculated the residual land value for the two big sites, he'd done it on a net developable area. I mean, as I said, it doesn't seem to quite be matching up what the reality should be, but yeah, thank you. Okay, Mr. Seabury, I think.
Thank you, sir. I mean, we've got a bit of a funny one where we've got the western part of Skirningham Garden Village, which falls within two ward boundaries, which are both medium typologies. So on the face of it, we're not faced with the issue that Mr. Hall is in terms of what the percentage of affordable housing should be. But I think what's interesting is we've also got another proposed housing allocation, Site 95, which sits within the Heinton ward, and it's just that difference in terms of is this ward boundary, is that approach really correct? So the Heinton ward covers the northern part of Darlington. It's a very large ward, and no, I don't think it is. I don't think it is a sound approach to actually take that ward as a whole and assign land values and whatever else across such a wide geographical patch, which is predominantly rural in nature, but happens to incorporate a very small part of the northern part of the town. So I think it's just a useful example as to how that approach is maybe not quite right.
But is there a better one? That's, I mean, there's no perfect way of dividing up a borough into different areas. You've got to take some meaningful geographies that you can do an analysis of, or you take the whole borough and just average it out, which I don't think anyone's suggesting. So I don't know. I mean, there's flexibility in the sense that if any particular site diverges significantly from what the viability assessment assumes, you've got the ability to do a site-specific viability assessment. But as I say, we all want to try and avoid that as far as possible, but I'm not sure. Okay. Right, Mr. Madison.
Thank you, sir. I'm clearly not on the same wavelength as the discussion that's been going, so I'm way further down, and I'm hoping that your expertise, sir, will be able to resolve the issue and understand it. For example, on the Connerscliff sites, there are some very large infrastructure issues that clearly need to be dealt with because haven't been dealt with over the last however many years, including extremely large strategic water mains that serve from Upper Teesdale to Teesside, overhead lines, all sorts of bits and pieces. I'm assuming that in the viability study, because I haven't read Mr. Simpson's report, so I do apologise, John, but has all of those on-site costs been taken into account in terms of the viability of the site? And also any off-site large strategic issues. So, for example, there is some suggested highway changes, what probably will be half a mile away from the site themselves. Will they be costed within the cost of that particular site or the viability of that particular site? And I know that will apply to many, many other sites, but I just wanted some comfort that you were relatively comfortable that that was paid for by the developer and, dare I say, not by the taxpayer in that respect. So that's one of my questions. Yeah. The second question is that I was actually quite shocked, and maybe I'm clearly in a different arena here, that there is a minimum sort of 20% profit that needs to be made by anybody and everybody. And brownfield sites clearly don't actually quite live up to that particular standard. So I do understand that people have got to make some money, and I do understand that people need to make some profits. But I would have thought that this plan is an opportunity, a springboard to clean the town up and possibly put some money into those brownfield sites or those areas that are not clean. And quite obviously, a lot of the guys that are talking now around the table are quite interested in the clean greenfield sites where the residual value is a little bit more, but there is more profit in them, as Mr. Simpson has actually suggested. And that to me is quite horrifying, that I'm not sure if the tail's wagging the dog here or the dog's wagging the tail. I would like to think that the town gets a better town at the end of this, be it cleaner, tidier, and more functional, as opposed to expanding into the areas that are easy and simple to build on. So I apologise if I've crossed a lot of boundaries there and stepped on people's toes.
No, thank you, Mr. Understood. I'll get the council to come back and respond to some of these points at the end about the specific one there about not necessarily just the Connerscliff park sites, but the whole issue about how infrastructure, offsite infrastructure, and particular constraints on sites are dealt with and how they're factored in and what assumptions are made. Councillor Snedker, please.
Thank you very much. 3 observations on this. The initial one is about what I'm hearing is a lot of caution from developers around costs. And this obviously stems from uncertainty about what the government's going to do next. And uncertainty is a very expensive environment in which to operate in. So it's a shame that we don't have more clarity on that. I think the Independent Committee on Climate Change is ahead of the game on this one. We need government to catch up on that, and that will make everyone's job a lot easier there. One observation is about the viability appraisal going out to developers and not one of them coming back with any concerns or problems. And maybe the cynic in me thinks maybe that that's a little bit too generous then if no one complains, and maybe complaints is a good thing when it comes from people who are in business. But that's, again, maybe just me being a cynic. The final thing I'll say is about the delivery on brownfield sites from social housing by the council. And obviously these are more complicated sites, and it's good to see them being put to use. But there's a stark contrast between commercial developers for house for sale and their concerns about energy efficiency. It bears in mind, as councils building social housing, we don't then sell them and walk away. We are landlords. And so any changes in legislation for energy efficiency and standards of housing, it stays with us as a council. And so anything we put into a new build, often, if we don't go as high as possible, we have to go back and put right later on. Whereas houses for sale, it's the householder who's left having to invest in energy efficiency in the future. So that will have an impact on the value of the property or the amount of money we can put into a property. So those are my 3 observations on viability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Armstrong.
Yes, thank you, sir. I would only add that in consideration of the unprecedented material inflation that the construction industry is suffering at the moment, and I accept it is born particularly out of shortages. However, if you compare today's prices with the prices of 2017, if I heard correctly previously, there is a significant difference. And if the calculations are based on those prices, you need to reconsider.
Sorry, so this is the assumptions made in the viability assessment about the build costs, construction costs, various materials having gone up a lot in the recent years, and whether they're out of date.
Actually, in recent months, the last 2 or 3 years have been pretty reasonable inflation.
Right.
However, in the last 2 or 3 months, it's been unprecedented, with some significant increases beyond 50% as it stands at the moment.
Okay.
Figures
thank you.
year.
Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other issues regarding infrastructure, and particularly around brownfield sites. I know that calculations have been done about the provision of new infrastructure on greenfield sites, which will obviously be very high because everything has to be built from new. However, many brownfield sites already have all the roads, they already have the sewerage nearby. It's a relatively, while substations may have to be added, it's relatively simple to connect them to the existing grids and water mains, etc. And I'm concerned as to whether this has been taken into account, such that the viability, the brownfield sites are not coming out as viable when they should have lower infrastructure costs. Yes, I agree that for some the decontamination costs, etc., might be higher, but there will be brownfield sites where this shouldn't be an issue, or it's likely to be a lower issue. It depends on the knowledge of the site, obviously. So I do think that needs to be taken into account. And also, as regards town centre sites, particularly as we have recently attracted some jobs up from London, and there's the question about whether people will actually move or not. But as you get more people potentially moving from higher density urban areas, there is likely to be more of an expectation that we have more dense building, townhouses and flats. I discussed with somebody from, I think it was in the Reading area, and they could not understand why we had undeveloped brownfield sites in and around our town centre, because they're snapped up and developed, and they're very profitable. So whilst it may be different from what has been built in the Darlington area in the past, that doesn't mean it's not viable, because you can cram more homes in at greater density, and therefore they can be just as profitable as the large sprawling kind of family homes that we see so much of in out of town estates. Also, my concern relates to large infrastructure, which is often a euphemism for new roads in Darlington. I wanted to flag up that a lot of the out of town estates appear to it will be covered, no doubt, in the location question, but they appear to have been placed out of town so as to be able to build an outer ring road effectively. And my concern is that the building of that road comes with greater costs, whereas there would be much lower infrastructure costs if building were to take place in the town centre, and Section 106 monies from that could instead be used to, for example, redesign the nearby main road to reallocate space from cars to sustainable transport options, or to help to insulate the nearby already existing homes.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments before I go back to the council to pick up on some of the issues that have been raised there? Councillor Armstrong, you've got your hand up, but I think, is that left over from before? Okay, right. So, yeah, Mr. Usher, Mr. Simpson, there's a few issues there. One was whether the £25,000 for the wheelchair adaptable homes was factored in. There was issues about the infrastructure costs and what assumptions are made for things like the Conisbury Park sites, for example, you know, high infrastructure costs that there might be. What else was there? Yeah, the whole approach to brownfield, really, and whether the assumptions are valid when you apply these sort of infrastructure assumptions, Section 106 assumptions for brownfield sites, the typologies, why are they coming out as unviable? Any others as well that you want to pick up on? Right, who's going? Mr. Simpson, your microphone's muted.
Terribly sorry. I think I'll start with the Coniscliffe Park question in terms of sorry, I think in terms of the M4 adaptations, we have used figures that were originally provided by EC Harris within the policy. I think Matthew may have clarified. I think we set the I think levels of the two levels of accessibility is M43 and M423 at 47% and 9% respectively. We've costed the higher level for adaptation about £10,700 per property, not £25,000. That's the most recent and up-to-date information we have in terms of the costs. I don't know if you want to add anything to this, Matthew, because I'm sort of working blind here. Sorry.
Yes, it was just to add that 10,700 figure that was used was the figure that was identified in the EC Harris report for M43A rather than the higher figure for M43B. Because of the way that our policy is worded, it specifies predominantly for M43A rather than for M43B. We've used the slightly lower cost in the EC Harris report that doesn't allow for, there's two costs in the EC Harris report, one that allows for additional space that's needed as part of the adaptations, but because the average build cost, the average size of the dwelling factored into the calculation for the build cost is in line with nationally described space standards. as it sets out in that report. We haven't made that higher allowance because that allowance has already been made. So that's why we've used the figure that we've used.
Okay. Okay, that deals with the wheelchair accessible. You were going to say something about infrastructure, for example, the Connors.
Yes, thank you, sir. So in terms of Constable Park, we haven't done the site-specific viability appraisal on that one. So that level of work hasn't been done. There's an assumption within the viability appraisal that there'll be an element of off-site costs anyway, and there'll also be a highways infrastructure as well. In terms of site-specific viability appraisal, that's not been done. Site-specific appraisals have only been done on the 2 strategic sites.
Yeah, but things like if there's a particular sort of pipeline or something, I mean, there's the abnormals assumption and the contingencies assumption have been factored in. Are those to deal with things like that potentially?
That's right. I mean, I think it'll fall under one. I'm not sure which typology it falls under, but you're right. There'll be assumptions about abnormal costs and contingency. You're right. But in terms of a site-specific assessment, we've just not done that. Yes, I've not done that. Does that answer your question, sir?
I think he's frozen again.
Oh. Yeah, can you hear me again now?
Yes, so you froze.
Can you hear me?
You're back, sir.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I'm back in. I don't know why that's happened again. Yeah, the issues described by Councillor Holroyd about, well, surely brownfield sites are cheaper because the infrastructure's there. You don't need to build new roads. You don't need to put in new water supplies and electricity, close to electricity supplies, all those sort of things. So why are all your brownfield typologies coming out unviable? Is it not skewed in some way? I think is the suggestion.
No, it's not. I mean,
Mr. Simpson.
Sorry, sir. Yeah, no, it's not. I mean,
that's interesting. I can't hear you, Mr. Simpson, even though your microphone doesn't seem to be muted.
Can you hear me now? Can anybody else hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear.
Yes.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to pause for a minute.
Mr. Simpson, can you speak to me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear him. Can you hear him now?
Yeah, I'm coming back. Right, maybe it's just telling us we've had a long day and it's time to finish, which is probably about right. Can you hear me now?
Can, yes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, okay. Right, thank you. Mr. Simpson, do you want to just pick up on the issue about the brownfields?
Yes, sir. In terms of the brownfield sites, it's not particularly skewed away from them. It's actually to reflect the fact that brownfield sites tend to have more issues than greenfield sites. Previously developed sites cost more, so you could expect more abnormal costs, whether it's remediation, underground structures, anything. We haven't consciously sort of prejudiced any work on this. We've actually tried to be realistic about it, and we also can't make assumptions about the fit for purpose level of infrastructure. Realistically speaking, we have to assume that the infrastructure is going to have to be addressed. Therefore, it'd be dangerous to assume the infrastructure is in place for all sites. So some of the sites that we have on the sort of urban extensions will be quite close to established infrastructure, but we've been universally in our approach to be consistent. But brownfield sites problems are well known, so I think that's possibly the only answer I can give. We've not consciously skewed things away from brownfield sites.
No. But the way that you've done your typologies and the site size typologies and the assumptions you make about different sorts of typologies reflect the location and the what you think of as the likely infrastructure and other requirements associated with those, and they're different for different types of site. Okay, right, yeah, okay. I am wanting to finish in the next few minutes. I know Mr. Madison and Councillor Holroyd, do you want to make 2 brief final points, Mr. Madison?
Just very, very quickly, going back to what Mr. Simpson said about Connerscliffe site, and a proper viability study hasn't been done. I'm not quite sure then how you can actually stack that up as being something that goes into the plan.
Okay, understood. The approach is described and set out as the way the national policy sets it up is that you don't have to do an individual appraisal of every single site. You can do what they call the typologies, and it would fall within one of those. Anyway, Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much. I wanted to add 2 more points. Obviously, the issue with the brownfield sites and as to whether the land values were being calculated too high. You know, if it's not working out as viable, then potentially the land values need to be reduced so that they are viable after all the costs are taken into account, or further site specific work needs to be done to work out if there is viability there, because I'm very concerned that we have this donut of deprivation, that we don't perpetuate it. The other thing is that I wanted to flag that the Darlington's housing targets, as you will have worked out, are a lot higher than the objective assessment of need. And this suggests that there is that the viability assessment might be too lenient, and there'd be more headroom for improved building standards and that sort of thing, so as to improve quality of life in Darlington.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think what we'll do is come to a finish there. We've had a good session of viability. Some of these issues we can come back to a certain extent. I don't want to go back over the viability assessment in any great detail, unless, well, I'll reflect on what I've heard today, and if there's anything further I need. On that, I think it would be helpful if certainly one thing would be to do an updated version of Table 10 in CDO8, which basically gives an indication for it's not so much the not viable, or well, we'll define what marginal means. I think you might have described it as being they could be viable if you took less developer profit. I think it might have been the what you said, but certainly for where the sites that are categorised as viable, to give an indication in 2 ways. And I think one would be the percentage above the benchmark land value, and 2, the pounds per hectare above the benchmark land value, if that's possible. Just in a simple one more column, I think you could take the word viable out because it's not needed. That's what green means, and you could put a figure in that column, or 2 figures, basically just a percentage above benchmark land value and a pounds per hectare of surplus that there is. So that would help me to understand that. I'm not quite sure what to ask for here. Maybe I'll do a note tomorrow, but I think something just to clarify what the benchmark land values are that you've assumed to be appropriate. I think for clarity, you ought to say one way or the other, they're either gross, based on the gross site area, i.e. you've got to incentivise the owner of all of that land to sell it. So that's what the benchmark land value I'd have thought would be. But if it's not the case, I think you'd have to explain why. I think I'm going to assume it is the case, unless you can convince me otherwise. I think I might leave it like that for today, and if I have any further thoughts, I might deal with that tomorrow. Councillor Holroyd, yeah.
Thank you very much. Just as a potential extension to your idea on the viability, would it be worth for any sites which are not quite viable, it would be interesting to see by how much, because if it's very marginal, then I would urge that those sites, if they were in desirable locations, that the council could do further work to make them viable if it was very marginal.
Understood. I don't think it's an onerous task to say, actually, for all of the amber and green and red, indeed, either plus or minus in percentage terms against the benchmark land value. Is that right? You've got those figures, Mr. Simpson, yeah? Yeah. So on the green ones, it'll be benchmark land value plus, 20%, 50%, 100%, and the orange ones would be, BLV minus whatever. That's possible to do, yeah?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, and I'm sure I've seen that in other viability assessments. It does give you a bit more of a subtle understanding of what it actually is telling us. Right, it is 5 o'clock, so that's an appropriate time to come to a halt today. Is there any other queries or questions or anything that we need to talk about? I think in addition to the action point I've just itemised there, I think we had some from earlier, but it's a bit late in the day to go back through it now. So I think what I will do probably is to go through my notes and just pick up any action points, clarify them first thing tomorrow morning. Mr. Baker, sorry, I know you had your hand up a while ago. So yes, do you want to just?
It's fine. So I mean, I'm certainly don't want to drag this out any further. It was just we did have a query about whether costs were subject to inflation as it would appear revenues are,
right, yeah.
And it was just to get that clarified. It was something that my client Story Homes had raised during their review of the appraisal, so it's a simple clarification point. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's the inflation issue, is it, looking ahead?
No inflation
for costs or values.
Neither. So it's based on current values and costs, or at the time the information was available.
Yeah, there was the point raised about the high some of the construction build costs have risen a lot in the last few months. Is that anything
I understand that, sir. And I mean, I think we are sort of aware of what the market changes have been, but also values have increased as well. I mean, there's been we're aware of increases in costs and values as well. So it's difficult to predict inflation. I know BCIS forecast inflation, but we're only as good as the information we have at the time. But I do appreciate costs have increased. I also I'm wholly aware that revenues have increased as well as in values.
Yeah, so you can't start fiddling with some of the assumptions without changing all the others. So you've done it at a moment in time. You've used the information that was available as suggested by the PPG. That's the basis, and you'd have to redo the whole thing if you needed to update it all, and it could go different ways. And
yes, sir.
But hence, again, the need to have an understanding of how much flexibility there is in these conclusions, really, in terms of the cushion. So it'd be interesting to see that. And right, okay. Well, thank you all for your contributions this afternoon. Some of us are back tomorrow morning at 9:30 for matter 2, which I think is probably to do with the development needs assessments for the amount of housing land and employment land and those sort of things. So unless there's any final comments or queries, I will finish there. Okay, thank you. And I'll see some of you tomorrow.
Thank you. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Thank you.